The imperial banners fluttered high above Frostvale's fractured battlements, their crimson sigils etched in gold catching the light of a waning sun. Ash drifted lazily across the ruined courtyards, swirling around the broken walls and collapsed gates. The air, thick with the scent of blood, soot, and frozen pine, clung to the earth like a death shroud, a bitter reminder of what had been lost and what had been gained. Silence reigned in the aftermath, save for the distant crackle of fires burning in the heart of the fortress. Kael stood alone atop the highest tower, the wind whipping his cloak behind him like a banner of war, the icy chill biting at his skin. His golden eyes narrowed as they scanned the frost-laced horizon, taking in the remnants of Frostvale, once a symbol of defiance, now reduced to a smoking ruin. To most, the victory was complete. The rebellion had been crushed with brutal efficiency, its leaders laid low by a strategy so precise that even the greatest of generals would have admired it. Songs would be sung, and tales would be told of how a kingdom's resolve was broken in an instant. But Kael did not share in that triumph. He did not crave the glory of war. He craved control. Behind him, the sound of boots crunching against the frostbitten stone brought him back to reality. Saria appeared at his side, her silhouette sharp against the dimming light, her expression unreadable as always. "You've crushed Frostvale, broken its will, claimed its soldiers." "Most rulers would toast to such a day," she remarked, her voice cool but laced with a touch of curiosity. Kael didn't turn his gaze from the horizon. "Rulers drink to days like this because they think they've won." "I know better." Saria raised an eyebrow, her lips curling slightly in amusement. "You think it's not over?" Kael's lips thinned, his expression unreadable. "I know it's not," he said, his voice flat. "Victory inspires envy. Power draws the desperate." This was a warning shot. "The next one will be aimed at my back." Saria chuckled softly, the sound of it like ice cracking. "Then maybe you should start wearing armor when you sleep." Kael's lips twitched in the faintest semblance of a smile, but his eyes remained cold, calculating. "I trust you'll watch my back more effectively than any steel plate." She smirked, stepping closer, her presence a shadow at his side. "You know I will." For a moment, they stood in silence, watching as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the fortress bathed in the eerie glow of the fires that still crackled in the heart of Frostvale. The ruins were a testament to the ferocity of Kael's conquest, a brutal reminder of what happened to those who dared to defy him. Inside the great hall of the fortress, once the proud heart of Lord Alric's rebellion, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of defeat. The massive iron doors hung open, letting in the bitter cold air, and the firelight flickered and cast long, dancing shadows across the stone floor. The remnants of Alric's army knelt in chains, their faces hollow with exhaustion, their bodies broken not by the sword but by the crushing weight of their failure. The soldiers were not the ones who had been defeated in battle. They had been defeated before they ever raised their swords. Kael's strategy had been so precise, so devastating, that they never stood a chance. The rebellion's strength had been reduced to nothing more than a dying flicker before it was snuffed out in the cold wind of reality. Kael's footsteps rang out, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the hall like a death toll. He moved through the remnants of the once proud army, his eyes cold as ice, measuring each broken man before him. He knew them for what they were, pawns in a game they didn't understand. "You fought for a lie," Kael's voice rang out, calm yet laden with an iron edge. "And your leader paid the price." A young officer, barely more than a boy, lifted his chin defiantly, though his eyes betrayed the fear that gripped him. "We fought for freedom. We chose to die on our feet." Kael's gaze hardened as it locked onto the officers. The boy faltered, his resolve breaking like glass under the weight of Kael's scrutiny. The tension in the room was palpable. "Then stand," Kael said, his voice soft but deadly. "And die." The officer trembled, his shoulders shaking as he lowered his gaze, unable to meet Kael's cold stare any longer. Kael turned to Rhys, who had been standing nearby, observing the scene with a quiet intensity. "Any who refuse the oath by sunrise, ye make examples of them publicly." Rhys nodded, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with the same cold fire that fueled Kael. "Yes, my lord." "And the families of the officers?" Kael asked, his tone still detached, as though he were discussing the weather. Saria, always sharp, spoke before Rhys could answer. "Exiled, unless they swear fealty. We burn out the roots, or the weed grows back. Kael nodded, his decision made. Good. Leave no room for rebellion to take root again. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Kael's words settled over them like the weight of the mountain itself. The rebellion had been crushed, but the price had been steeper both for those who had fought and for those who would live to serve. Later that night, the fires of Frostvale burned brighter, yet there was no joy in the flames. The banners that once flew proudly in the face of the Empire were consumed by the cleansing heat, their ashes scattered in the wind. The propaganda that had fueled the rebellion was reduced to nothing more than cinders and smoke, vanishing into the darkening sky. Inside the keep, Kael sat alone in the gloom of his private quarters, the only light the flickering fire in the hearth. His fingers drummed absent-mindedly against the arm of his chair as he stared into the flames, his thoughts far from the victory he had just secured. The wine beside him remained untouched, its ruby color a mockery of the blood spilled just hours ago. The door creaked open, and Saria entered without invitation, as was her custom. Her presence was a shadow in the doorway before she stepped into the room, her eyes studying him with that ever-present intensity. "You crushed them without even drawing your sword. That should feel like victory," she said, her voice soft, though it held an underlying curiosity. Kael did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the fire, watching the way the flames danced and twisted, flickering like the hopes of those who had dared to challenge him. "Victory doesn't feel," he murmured, his voice low. "People do." Saria regarded him carefully, her expression softening slightly. She moved closer, her footsteps silent on the stone floor. "You're thinking of what comes next." Kael's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was devoid of warmth. "Always." She studied him, her eyes searching for the cracks in his facade, the moments when the man beneath the cold exterior would break free. But she found none. "You're relentless," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. "That's why you'll win." Kael finally turned to face her, his golden eyes burning with quiet intensity. "No," he replied, his voice low and filled with a quiet gravity. "That's why I can't afford to lose." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, each of them feeling the weight of the moment. Outside, the mountain winds howled against the fortress walls, but within, there was only stillness, a calm before the storm. Kael rose from his seat, his movements deliberate, purposeful. He placed the untouched goblet of wine on the table, his gaze shifting to Saria. "Send word to the southern governors," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I want Frostvale's roads rebuilt within the month. I want trade flowing before the thaw." Saria raised an eyebrow. "You're rebuilding already?" Kael's expression was unreadable as he turned to look out the window at the burning ruins below. "Victory is not measured in blood. It's measured in how quickly they forget they ever resisted." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. They were a reminder that Kael's ambitions extended far beyond mere conquest. To him, power was not an Ufu, it was the erasure of all opposition, the rewriting of history to ensure that only his rule remained. And as the fires continued to burn in the distance, Kael's mind was already turning, plotting his next move in a game that never seemed to end. The night was thick with an oppressive cold, the frost-laden air creeping into every crevice of Frostvale. The wind howled like a beast, threading through the shattered remains of rebellion, its cold fingers curling around the broken battlements and torn flags. Fires still smoldered along the outer wards, their orange glow painting the ruins in a haunting light, casting long shadows across the stone corridors of the fortress. The world outside seemed to tremble in the wake of the insurrection's fall. Inside the war room, Kael stood surrounded by maps and parchment, the walls lined with insignia of defeated factions and empires past. Frostvale was his now, but the conquest of a city was only ever the beginning of a war. The Empire's wounds ran deeper than any stone or steel could heal. Beneath the layers of rubble and ruin, something festered, a something far more dangerous than rebellion. Kael's eyes were fixed on a map of the southern provinces, his fingers tracing the delicate lines that marked roads and territories. "Alric fell too easily," Kael muttered to himself, his golden eyes narrowing as they swept southward, lingering on regions yet untouched by his hand. "Which means others are waiting, watching." Rhys, standing by his side, did not speak, but his sharp gaze followed Kael's every movement, as ever vigilant. Saria, perched casually against a pillar at the far end of the room, sipped from a goblet of dark red wine, her eyes scanning the room with the ease of a predator surveying her domain. Kael's voice broke the silence. "The nobles who backed Hemostatus?" Rhys answered without hesitation, his voice crisp. "Some have already pledged their loyalty, eager for a new order. Others a broken bar are still uncertain, waiting to see how far your shadow will stretch." Kael's fingers drummed against the table, each tap a reminder of the power he wielded. "Then we'll show them just how long my shadow truly is." Saria raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the coldness of his tone. "Fear or favor?" she asked, a challenge in her voice. Kael did not look up from the map, his gaze fixed on the borders of the Empire. "Neither. I'll offer them chains dressed as opportunity, and if they refuse?" Saria grinned, a flash of predatory glee in her expression. "We tighten the chains." Kael's lips curled into a brief, dangerous smile. His eyes gleamed like molten gold as he turned to face the remnants of the rebellion, which were now kneeling before him in the grand hall. The once celebratory space here adorned with tapestries, banners, and the echoes of past feasts was now a mausoleum of failed resistance. The torches flickered and danced along the walls, casting long, jagged shadows over the broken bodies of the former rebel lords. Before him stood 10 noblemen, each once a power broker in their own right, now nothing more than puppets in Kael's intricate game of domination. Their wrists were bound by thick chains, their pride crushed under the weight of Kael's calculated control. They knelt before him, forced to look up at the stone throne upon which he sat, a throne carved from the heart of Frostvale itself. Silence stretched across the room, so profound that even the faint crackling of the fire seemed distant and muted. Kael made no move for several moments, letting the silence scrape away at their dignity. It was a moment designed to make them reflect on their fate, to feel the weight of their actions and the finality of their choice. He broke the stillness with a low, resonant voice that carried the weight of power and consequence. "You backed Alric," Kael said, his words a cold lash that sliced through the air. "You fed him gold, soldiers, whispers. You thought him your future." Lord Valen, the eldest and the most defiant of the noblemen, raised his head with great effort, his voice trembling but tinged with defiance. "The Emperor is fading," he said, his eyes burning with a flicker of rebellion. "The court is corrupt. We sought change." Kael's gaze was unwavering, his voice like a blade that cut through the air without effort. "And in your version of change, the Empire burns?" Valen opened his mouth to retort, but Kael leaned forward, his golden eyes narrowing to slits. "I offer you a choice," Kael said, his voice low and dangerous. "Kneel in truth, or die a lie." There is no middle ground. For a moment, the room was heavy with indecision. The noblemen exchanged fleeting glances, the weight of their choices pressing down on them. One by one, the truth began to dawn on them. They were not dealing with a man who could be bribed or threatened. Kael's power was beyond their reach. A voice, smooth and calculated, rose from the shadows. Lord Reinhold, a man known for his cunning and eloquence, spoke with careful deliberation. "You could have killed us already," he said, his tone steady despite the fear that lurked beneath. "But you didn't." "That means you see value in us." Kael smiled faintly, the expression more dangerous than any scowl. "You mistake patience for mercy," he replied, his voice a low growl. Reinhold faltered, his earlier bravado slipping. He adjusted, shifting the weight of his words. "If we servier truly servier, you'll find us more useful alive than dead." Kael's gaze hardened, his eyes like molten gold. "Then understand what service means," he said slowly, his words deliberate and cutting. "Heavier taxes, conscription, total disclosure of your wealth and secrets. Disobedience will not be punished, it will be erased." A tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of labored breathing. The noblemen looked to one another, weighing their options. What remained in their eyes was not defiance, but understanding. Kael was not a man they could manipulate. He was not a ruler who could be swayed by promises or threats. He was a force of nature, and they were caught in his storm. One by one, their heads lowered. They knelt in unison, their pride stripped away by the weight of Kael's uncompromising authority. Kael rose slowly from his seat, his golden eyes sweeping across the room. "Loyalty," he said softly, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Loyalty is not given, it is forged." And tonight, the chains would hold. Later that evening, In the quiet of his private chambers, Kael sat alone, his thoughts a turbulent storm beneath the calm surface. The reports on the rebellion's final surrender came in waves: settlements, surrenders, fading riots. Frostvale was falling into his grasp like snow melting in a closed fist. But the Empire itself? That was a different story. There were far more subtle games being played in the shadows than any army could prepare for. A knock interrupted his musings. Enter. The door creaked open, and Lady Alira stepped into the room. Her presence was elegant, her posture poised with the grace of a dancer. Every inch of her radiated control, the kind that made even the air around her feel electric. She wore emerald silk that flowed behind her, a deliberate display of wealth and status. Her eyes, however, were sharp, the kind that cut through lies with a single glance. "You summoned me?" she asked, her voice cool and steady. Kael studied her with the focus of a predator sizing up its prey. "You have yet to swear loyalty," he said, his tone low but commanding. Alira did not flinch. Instead, she met his gaze with an intensity that spoke of defiance. "Because loyalty to a man like you is not a vow," she replied, her voice laced with a cold, dangerous edge. "It's a sentence." Kael raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her forthrightness. "Then argue for a lighter one," he said, his golden gaze fixed upon her. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate, her presence overwhelming. "Alric's rebellion survived as long as it did because I fed it," she said, her voice steady, calculating. "I know where the supplely roots still breathe. I know the traitors who did not kneel tonight." Kael's expression remained unreadable. "And what do you want in return?" he asked, his voice sharp as a whip. Alira's eyes glittered, and for the first time, a hint of a smile played at the corners of her mouth. "A place beside the throne, not beneath it." From the shadows, Saria's voice curled through the room like a soft, warning hiss. "Ambitious, dangerous." Kael stood, his gaze never leaving Alira. He circled her once, his eyes assessing her every move. "And clever," he added, his voice thoughtful. "You know the language of power, Alira." "Let me hear it in your name." Alira did not smile, but the smallest curve of her lips betrayed her satisfaction. "I understand the language of power. I will speak it for you." Kael's eyes glittered with a quiet hunger. "You'll have your influence and protection," he said slowly. "But you will earn your place beside me." Alira met his gaze, her own unblinking, unwavering. "And if I fail?" she asked, her voice soft but lethal. Kael's tone dropped to something far more intimate, a whisper that felt like the promise of a storm. "Then you'll learn what loyalty truly means." From the other side of the chain, Alira's eyes darkened, but she didn't break her gaze. "Then I won't fail," she said, her voice as cold and determined as the night outside. Kael nodded, his expression unreadable. Behind them, Saria poured another glass of wine, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "Looks like we're going to need a bigger war room," she remarked, her voice dripping with amusement. Kael's eyes gleamed. The game had only just begun. The cold night wrapped itself around Frostvale like a tightening noose, and the wind screamed through the shattered remnants of the rebellion, howling as it found every crack, every broken window, every neglected corner. The once proud fortress now felt like a tomb, silent but alive with the thrum of power-shifting hands. Inside the war hall, the air was thick with tension, hanging heavy like the storm that loomed on the horizon. Torches flickered against the stone walls, casting long, warped shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe, hungry for something they could devour. It was not peace that filled the room, but anticipation, sharpened to a deadly edge. The calm before the storm. Kael sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his gaze distant, calculating, eyes half-lidded as he studied the reports scattered before him. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished surface of the table, the sound a steady pulse in the otherwise oppressive silence. The maps before him, now littered with pins, seals, and blood, a testament to the Empire's violent fractures, did not bring him peace. They weighed on him. Victory had been claimed, but the true cost of that victory had yet to be counted. Frostvale was his. But the weight of empire, the mantle of command, bore down on him, a pressure unlike any battlefield he had ever faced. His mind was sharp, but even he knew that a sharp blade could only cut so far before it began to dull. Across from him, Saria sat reclined on a crimson chaise, swirling her wine with languid ease. The wine shimmered in the flickering light, catching the flame of the torches, a reflection of her grace and her deadly, effortless beauty. Yet beneath her calm exterior, Kael could feel the tension radiating from her. She had a keen sense of the room, the currents of power shifting, as much as he did. Behind her, Rhys stood like a shadow, his eyes cold and unblinking, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blade. He was always watchful, always silent, and Kael knew better than to overlook him. The tension in the room was palpable, and Rhys's stance reflected it. The man was always prepared for the inevitable conflict, ever the sentinel at Kael's side. "The nobles have sworn their loyalty," Rhys said, his voice low and measured, breaking the silence like a blade through cloth. "Or so they say." Kael didn't raise his eyes from the map, his fingers still drumming absent-mindedly against the table. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Loyalty gained through fear is a currency that depreciates quickly," he murmured. "But while it holds value, a broken bar, I intend to spend it." Rhys's brow furrowed. "Fear fades, and when it does, they'll search for cracks." "There are always cracks." Kael finally lifted his gaze, the sharpness in his golden eyes cutting through the room like a blade through silk. "Let them. I want them to look. Because the moment they think they've found one, I'll remind them what lies beneath the surface." His voice was calm, but the promise in it was undeniable. Saria chuckled softly from her seat, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her goblet. "You speak like a god weaving fate." Kael's smirk deepened, his eyes never leaving the map. "Not fate, structure. Gods are worshipped. I'm obeyed." A brief silence followed his words, thick and heavy, as the three of them absorbed the weight of the moment. Then Rhys spoke again, the steel in his voice unwavering. "There's another matter. Lady Illyria awaits outside." Kael's eyes flickered with interest, though his expression remained cool. "Bring her in." As the heavy doors to the war hall creaked open, Lady Illyria entered, a vision of poise and calculated danger. Her emerald gown, rich as the darkest forest, shimmered under the torchlight, flowing like liquid silk as she moved with a grace that was almost otherworldly. She did not bow, did not kneel. She didn't need to. She was not here to submit, but to negotiate. "My lord," she said, her voice smooth like velvet, but sharp as a knife. She didn't wait for permission. "I bring news." Kael gestured lazily, a subtle, almost dismissive movement. "Speak." She stopped at the edge of the table, her posture perfect, regal. A quiet moment passed before she set down a sealed scroll before him with an almost deliberate slowness, drawing Kael's full attention to it. "Half of the noble houses who pledged fealty today have already begun plotting," she said calmly, her voice a contrast to the storm of uncertainty swirling around the room. "3 are raising private militias in secret. 2 have sent envoys beyond imperial borders seeking allies." Saria's eyebrow arched. "Already?" "Barely a day has passed." Illyria's lips twitched in an almost imperceptible smile. "Desperation makes fools out of even the cleverest men," she replied. "They are scrambling, hoping to strike before you consolidate." Rhys's stance tightened, his eyes cold. "Outreach beyond the Empire? That's not defiance, that's treason." Kael unrolled the scroll with a casual flick, his eyes scanning the names without expression. A beat passed, and then he spoke, his voice calm, yet laced with a deadly promise. "Kill the messengers. Send their hands back in velvet-lined boxes. Let their blood speak louder than ink." There was no hesitation in his tone, only the cold certainty of someone who had already mapped out every consequence and found no fear in its outcome. Rhys nodded in acknowledgement, but Kael's voice dropped an octave, a subtle shift in the room's energy. "As for the noble families, a broken bar." He paused, savoring the tension that thickened in the air. "1 execution. Public. Select the loudest among them." Saria's lips curved into a faint smile. "Only 1? I expected fireworks." Kael's golden gaze snapped toward her, sharp and unyielding. "Fireworks dazzle. Fear lingers." His voice was low, almost a growl, the weight of his words sinking into the room like a stone dropped into still water. His words settled like ash, quiet but potent, a suffocating calm that left no room for argument. Illyria, ever composed, stepped forward once again, her voice measured but laced with quiet challenge. "Efficient, ruthless, but fear has limits." Kael met her gaze directly, his eyes unblinking, calm yet filled with the certainty of someone who had stared death in the face more times than he cared to count. "Fear isn't the end. It's the introduction." She arched a brow, leaning forward slightly. "And after the introduction?" Kael didn't blink, his voice soft but filled with lethal intent. "Then I teach them the language of obedience." Saria, from the shadows, exhaled a soft laugh, her voice dripping with amusement. "You two speak like rival poets with knives behind your backs." Kael's smile was cold, but there was a gleam in his eyes, part amusement, part something darker. "I don't hide the blade." Illyria's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Neither do I." A charged silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken tension of their exchange. It was a strange dance, a mix of challenge, respect, and something more, a raw, untapped potential, all wrapped in layers of power and ambition. They were locked in a game, one neither of them would admit they were playing, yet both understood the rules. "You speak boldly, Lady Illyria," Kael said finally, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. "Not many get away with it." Illyria didn't flinch. Her eyes never wavered from his. "I don't intend to get away," she said, her voice low and steady. "I intend to remain." Saria chuckled from her place in the shadows, her voice soft, but unmistakably pleased. "Oh, I like her." Kael rose from his seat slowly, the sound of his movements deliberate, commanding. He walked toward Illyria, each step measured, purposeful. He stopped in front of her, his presence towering, not just physically but in every way that mattered. The room seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his gaze as he studied her, his golden eyes never leaving her face. "You claim you can offer more than intelligence, influence, control," he said, his voice low and almost predatory. "But to sit beside me, you must offer more than usefulness. You must offer certainty." Illyria did not flinch, did not waver in her stance. Her voice was steady, firm. "Then I will make myself indispensable." Kael tilted his head slightly, the glimmer of something dark dancing behind his eyes. "Be careful. In this court, those who succeed too well a broken bar often become targets." Her reply came without hesitation, her voice smooth, like silk wrapped around a blade. "Then I'll be sharper than the arrows aimed at my back." For a heartbeat, time seemed to stretch. Kael regarded her, not with judgment, but with something that resembled both respect and a warning. A smile spread across his lips, then a faint but genuine, a dangerous smile. And the game continued. The night air hung heavy, saturated with the scents of incense and the lingering traces of candle smoke that swirled through the dim corridors of Frost Vale's grandest chambers. The ancient stone walls, polished by time yet worn from centuries of power struggles, seemed to breathe in the quiet tension that clung to the room. Shadows flickered and twisted, elongating like ghosts with each delicate shift of the firelight. They seemed to recoil, as if wary of the darkness that had truly claimed the heart of the empire. At the window, Kael stood like a figure carved in stone, his silhouette framed by the heavy velvet drapes that hung from the ceiling. Outside, Frost Vale sprawled, its stone streets narrow and winding, a city pulsing with life but ignorant of the puppet master that now controlled its every movement. Below him, the flickering lights of the city spread like a constellation gone cold to its people, unaware of the grand game being played above them, unaware that they were but pieces in a much larger puzzle. Kael's golden eyes, gleaming with quiet intensity, reflected not the starlit sky, but the cold calculation of a man who did not wait for opportunities, he created them. His mind moved faster than the shifting shadows, his every thought a step ahead of the pieces on the board. Behind him, the room held its breath. Saria, draped in midnight silk, leaned casually against a pillar, the pale light catching the curve of her lips as she swirled wine in her goblet. Her eyes never fully rested on Kael. Instead, they skimmed the room, always alert, always searching for the next move in the game. Rhys, ever the stoic sentinel, stood at the door, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blade. There was nothing casual in his posture. He was always ready, always on guard. And at the table, Lady Illyria sat, her posture regal, her fingers tracing the edges of the parchment before her as though she were caressing the very fates of the empire. The air was thick with the weight of decisions that would alter the course of kingdoms. It was a silence, not of peace, but of anticipation of a storm that could break at any moment. Kael finally broke the stillness, his voice low but absolute. "The nobles move faster than I expected." Rhys, his gaze hardening, let out a soft grunt of acknowledgement. "Desperation sharpens the knife." Elira, her voice smooth as velvet, raised an elegant brow. "Or dulls it, depending on the hand holding it." Saria, ever the cynic, sipped her wine with languid ease. "Let them swing. They'll slit their own throats soon enough." "Cowards are predictable." Kael turned, his dark cloak sweeping around him like a shadow of its own, and approached the table with the deliberate grace of a predator. His steps were calculated, measured as silent as the flicker of a blade before it strikes. He paused before the table, where the parchment lay like a series of final judgments waiting to be read. "They think they can wound me with 1,000 cuts," he mused, his voice a sharp, disinterested whisper. "Let's show them what happens when you bleed." Shadows. Elira unrolled the scroll she had brought with deliberate elegance. Her fingers brushed across the surface as if savoring the moment of revelation. "Varmir gathers mercenaries," she began, her voice cutting through the tension like the first strike of a blade. "Raven seeks allies across the sea. Eldrin courts the merchant lords, whispering rebellion. The last of Viral and Thorny are waiting in silence. Cowards hiding behind caution." Kael's eyes scanned the names, his expression unreadable, a perfect mask of control. His lips curled in the faintest of smirks as he ran his fingertips along the edge of the scroll. "Predictable," he murmured. "But still useful." Rhys tilted his head, his eyes narrowing with an edge of curiosity. "Useful?" Kael's smirk deepened, a predatory gleam lighting his golden gaze. "A cornered beast doesn't reason, it lashes out, and when it does, the blood on the floor will be theirs." "Let them." Saria's lips quirked into a dark smile. "And you're going to let them think they have a chance?" Kael turned back to them, his expression calm yet so filled with the weight of certainty that it seemed almost otherworldly. "I'd risk nothing. I control the board. They just haven't seen the trap yet." Elira's eyes glittered faintly with challenge. She leaned forward, her posture unshaken, unyielding. "You'd risk letting them grow stronger?" Kael's voice dropped, as soft and chilling as the night itself. "I would risk nothing. I've already won. They just don't know it." Saria chuckled darkly, brushing her fingers along the rim of her goblet, the sound like a warning in the stillness. "This is the part you enjoy, isn't it?" Kael's gaze flicked to her for a brief moment, and in that moment, something flickered behind his usually composed exterior. There was a depth to his eyes, something beyond the endless machinations of his mind. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold precision of a man who lived to control. "Winning?" he mused aloud, his lips curling into a smile that was both dangerous and knowing. "Letting them believe they had a chance. That is the true victory." Elira tilted her head slightly, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips. "And what comes next?" Kael turned, his cloak trailing behind him as he moved to a side table draped in black velvet. He unlocked a chest of blackened oak with the ease of one who had mastered the art of both lock and mind. From within, he withdrew a set of documents, each one a carefully crafted letter to either make or break the houses under his thumb. With precision, he returned to the table and laid them across its surface, each paper a silent death sentence or a gift of life, depending on how one saw it. "Varmir's mercenaries are already bought," Kael said with casual finality, tapping one of the documents as if it were the conclusion of a sentence. "I had agents posing as rival employers. They will abandon Varmir when the time comes, or slit their throats for coin." Rhys nodded, a small glint of approval in his eyes. "And Riven?" Kael's lips parted slightly in the ghost of a smile. "Their ships were intercepted before they ever left port. Their reinforcements now serve me." Elira's eyes sparkled with intrigue. "And Eldrin?" Kael tossed a folded parchment onto the table with careless ease. "Merchants follow power. Eldrin promised rebellion. I offered profit." Saria let out a soft laugh, her tone dripping with admiration. "And what of Viral and Thorn?" Kael's golden gaze hardened, his eyes narrowing like a hawk sighting its prey. "We leave them for last. Once the others fall, fear will do the work for us." Elira leaned back, her lips curling into a small, amused smile. "Ruthless." Kael's voice dropped an octave, quiet and unyielding. "Efficient." The air in the room thickened again, this time with the weight of their shared understanding. In that moment, each of them knew the full extent of Kael's plan and not just the moves yet to be made. but the inevitability of it. The fates of entire houses had already been sealed in the space of a few breaths and a few sharp words. Saria raised her goblet high, her smile a wicked curve of pleasure. To the fools who think this is their game. Kael lifted his own cup in response, his gaze unwavering, eyes sharp and calculating. Let them believe it until the board collapses beneath their feet. And with that, the final click of the chessboard echoed in the stillness of the chamber. The Game of Thrones, of blood and whispers, moved into its next phase. Kael had already played his moves long before the first piece had even been set. The game was over before it had truly begun. The night held the capital in a tight, unyielding grip, as if the very air had grown heavy with the weight of secrets, deceit, and impending doom. The moon hung high above the sprawling city like a silent sentinel, its silver light spilling across the rooftops and casting long, ghostly shadows that stretched across the labyrinth of narrow alleys and towering spires. Every corner, every window seemed to hold a whisper, a murmur of things unseen, things lurking just beyond the edge of perception. Inside the heart of the imperial palace, the halls were eerily silent, save for the soft echo of footsteps on polished marble floors and the occasional flutter of banners stirred by a wind that seemed far too cold for the season. The stratagem chamber was a place of calculated precision, its stone walls lined with ancient scrolls, tomes bound in dark leather, and ledgers written in long-forgotten languages. It was here that Kael, the architect of ambition, sat alone in the shadow of his thoughts, his mind a razor-sharp edge that cut through the noise of the world with effortless precision. Kael's figure was a silhouette against the faint candlelight, his sharp features outlined by the flickering flame of a single candle beside him. He sat in a high-backed obsidian chair, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, the other drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm against the polished surface. The room around him seemed to hum with energy, silent but potent, like the stillness before a storm. His golden eyes gleamed in the dark, cold and calculating, betraying nothing of the storm that brewed beneath his composed exterior. Across the table stood Alira, her figure statuesque, her violet eyes flickering in the dim light. She was a woman who wore her calm like a second skin, a quiet force that had carved her way through the treacherous web of politics and power with a patience born of experience. Her gaze never wavered from Kael, though her mind, like his, was already plotting the next move in the game they played together. Between them lay a scroll, its parchment yellowed with age but still crisp with importance. The names and sigils upon it were a roll call of the Empire's disloyalty in noble houses, merchants, generals, each one marked with ink that burned like the seal of death. It was a map, not of land or sea, but of betrayal, greed, and ambition, a map that Kael had carefully drawn with his own hand. "They grow bolder," Alira murmured, her voice as soft as winter frost, but carrying the weight of prophecy. Her fingers traced the inked names with a deliberate grace, as if she were feeling the pulse of each traitor beneath her touch. Varmir presses harder in the outer provinces. Raven has courted emissaries from the southern isles under the cover of night. And Eldrina, broken by her finger, stopped at a sigil near the bottom. They quietly build alliances among the lesser lords. Pawns pretending to be players. Kael exhaled a slow breath, the sound of it like silk sliding over a sharpened blade. His gaze remained fixed on the scroll, but his thoughts were already weaving threads of calculation, his mind turning like the gears of a grand clock. "They mistake my silence for absence," he said, his voice low, controlled, like the hum of a blade just before it strikes. Alira's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, and in doing so, reveal their throats. A knock echoed through the chamber, breaking the silence like a sword cleaving through a fog. The door creaked open, and Rhys entered, his heavy armor glinting in the flickering light, his presence like a shadow that had come to life. He was a man who lived by the sword, whose loyalty to Kael was as unshakable as the foundations of the palace itself. "The reports have arrived," Rhys said, his voice a low growl that carried an undercurrent of tension. "Varmir is stockpiling arms, acquired shipments, hidden caches. They're preparing for open rebellion." Kael's golden eyes flicked up to meet Rhys's gaze, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Desperation always leaves fingerprints." Rhys paused, as if considering the weight of Kael's words, then continued, "They believe they've cornered you. Enough backing, enough numbers to make a move." A soft, dangerous chuckle escaped. The sound was smooth, almost too smooth, like oil sliding over steel. Then let them believe it. He rose from his seat, the movement fluid and predatory, his dark cloak swirling around him like the shadow of a predator stalking its prey. With a gesture, he beckoned for Illyria and Rhys to follow him. Together, the three of them moved through the palace corridors like ghosts, their footsteps silent against the cold stone floors. The silence around them was oppressive, but it was the kind of silence that Kael thrived in, an eerie calm before the chaos he was about to unleash. The corridor opened up into a wide balcony, the marble balustrades standing like silent sentinels against the night sky. Below, the capital sprawled out in the distance, the city of light and shadows, of dreams and nightmares. Lanterns flickered in the streets like dying stars, casting long, trembling shadows against the stone buildings. The city seemed peaceful, but Kael knew better. Beneath the surface, the streets were filled with whispers that carried with them the scent of rebellion, the taste of blood. Kael stood at the edge of the balcony, his cloak billowing in the wind as he gazed down upon the city. The moonlight bathed him in an ethereal glow, turning him into a figure of myth, a man of destiny and power. His voice, when it came, was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 years. "Power is not inherited," he said, his tone cold and deliberate. "It is seized, ripped from the hands of those who grow complacent." Rhys stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his blade. "What are your orders?" Kael turned to face him, his golden eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "Unleash the whispers," he said, his voice like velvet, but filled with the promise of a storm. "Let the city drink rumors like wine that Varmir, Riven, and Eldrin plot against the throne. Let the common folk taste the fear of treason." Illyria's eyes glinted with understanding, a slow smile playing on her lips as she tilted her head. "You mean to stoke the fire from below?" "Fear is the most loyal sword," Kael replied, his voice a low murmur. "When the people believe their peace is at stake, they will cry for blood. And when they scream for justice." A broken bar. He paused, his gaze cold and unyielding. "We will grant a task swift and merciless." Rhys nodded, his eyes hard and resolute. "Then the nobles will fall without a single battle." "No," Kael said, his voice a blade of ice. "They will fall with the world watching. And when their allies see the crowds cheering their demise, they will know who truly holds the reins." The wind picked up, sweeping through the balcony, tugging at the banners that hung high above the palace spires. Kael's figure was a shadow against the night, his eyes glimmering like twin embers as he looked down at the city below. Illyria's gaze lingered on him for a moment, a strange mix of admiration and caution in her eyes, as if seeing something that both frightened and fascinated her. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said softly, her voice tinged with both respect and wariness. Kael's lips curled into a smile that was more a baring of teeth than anything else. "No, Illyria," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "They're playing it." He stepped back into the shadows, the flickering candlelight swallowing him whole. "And I wrote the rules." The game had begun in earnest, and Kael had already set the pieces in motion. The world would watch, and they would see who truly held the power. The imperial palace loomed high above the sprawling capital, its stone walls slick with the weight of 1,000 years of history. The moon hung in the sky like a watchful sentinel, its pale light bathing the city in a soft, ethereal glow. The capital below shimmered, 1,000 lanterns casting their flickering light against the night, a sea of fireflies adrift in a velvet dark. The laughter and music drifting upward from the courtyards, once a sound of celebration, now felt hollow and mocking, almost like a dream that had overstayed its welcome. Kael stood alone atop the highest balcony, his silhouette framed against the lunar glow, his body still as the stone beneath his feet. His eyes, cold and calculating, drank in the view, the sprawling city below nothing more than a distant chessboard. The people celebrated in ignorance, unaware of the quiet storm gathering just beneath the surface, waiting for the first sign of weakness to tear it all asunder. He could feel the pulse of it, a tremor in the air, a vibration that rippled through the bones of the city, a prelude to the inevitable. No peace, he knew, lasted forever. Peace was an illusion, a fragile thing that existed only as long as someone was willing to feed it. The empire was built on blood, on deceit, on unspoken promises of power and control. But tonight, For the first time, Kael could sense the shifting winds of the faintest breath of rebellion, rising in the shadows. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft rustle of silk behind him. Selene emerged from the palace, her golden robes catching the moonlight, shimmering like the last embers of a dying fire. She moved toward him with the elegance of royalty, but tonight there was something in her eyes, something more than the usual practiced composure. There was a subtle unease behind her gaze, a flicker of doubt that she could not entirely conceal. "You've brought peace to the Empire, Kael," she said, her voice softer than usual, almost as if she were trying to read him, to understand the depths of his thoughts. "But a broken bar, do you believe it will hold?" Kael did not immediately respond. His gaze remained fixed on the city below, the flickering lights of the capital now seeming like tiny stars, insignificant in their fleeting beauty. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. "No peace is permanent," he murmured at last, his voice low, the words laced with a quiet certainty. "Only the illusion of it. And the illusion lives only as long as someone is willing to feed it." Selene fell silent, her gaze never leaving his back, as if searching for a crack in the armor of his resolve. "And you believe you're that someone?" Kael finally turned to face her, his golden eyes gleaming in the dim light, a blade unsheathed, ready for the next strike. "I know I am." Before Selene could respond, a knock at the doors broke the tension. A guard entered swiftly, his chest rising and falling with the urgency of his movements. His face was grim, shadowed with the kind of news that made even the most seasoned soldiers tense. "My lord." "Your Majesty," he began, bowing deeply. "Word from the borderlands. The hidden faction has made its move." Selene's expression tightened at the mention of the faction. The name Mia whispered in hushed corners, discussed only in secretive councils, had haunted the back rooms of power for years. A phantom force, never fully understood, only feared. Now, it seemed, they had revealed themselves, and Kael knew the true weight of their appearance. "Speak," Kael commanded, his voice like steel cutting through the thick air of the balcony. His stance remained unwavering, poised, like a predator scenting the first signs of prey. The guard stepped forward, his voice strained with the gravity of the news. "They struck Veritia," he reported. 3 garrisons burned to the ground, supply lines severed, entire regiments cut off and scattered. The enemy vanishes before we can even trace them. It's not just precision, it's anticipation. They know our every step before we take it." Kael's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, not one of amusement, but of recognition. The thrill of a worthy opponent. "At last." "And their leader?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer would not please him. The guard hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "They call him the Prophet. Some say he can see through time itself. Others claim he commands the very will of fate. Wherever he appears, we are already losing." Selene's voice trembled slightly, though her composure never fully faltered. "An enemy who can predict the future?" Kael chuckled low, a sound laced with both danger and dark amusement. "An enemy who believes he can." He turned to face her fully now, stepping closer, his voice low and cold as the night air that whipped around them. "And that, Selene, is far more dangerous." Selene studied him closely, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what do we do against such an enemy?" Kael's smile was sharp. "Dangerous. We can't play their game. Strategy will fail if the board is known. So, we change the game entirely." Selene's brow furrowed. "And what does that mean?" Kael took a step closer, his presence suffocating in its intensity. His gaze locked onto hers, the silence between them now charged with a palpable energy. "We become unpredictable," he said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the tension. "We become illogical. We create chaos, a war they can't foresee. They want a war of patterns, of precision. I'll give them a war of shadows." The air between them thickened, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the entire world had paused, holding its breath in anticipation of his next words. Selene's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "What do you need from me?" Kael stepped even closer, his fingers brushing a stray strand of her hair aside, the touch deliberate and possessive. He let the sensation linger before he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper against the cold wind. "Your trust," he said, his words carrying the weight of both command and invitation. "And your willingness to burn whatever remains sacred." Selene's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing to understand the true meaning behind his words. She stared at him, her gaze flickering between the man she had once admired and the man he was becoming. The Empress and the woman both existed within her, struggling to reconcile the two halves of her identity. "And what are we burning, Kael?" she asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Kael's expression hardened, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that could have shattered mountains. He didn't blink. "The world." And with that, the storm began. The wind howled through the palace balconies, carrying the scent of change, of power, of blood. The lanterns below flickered in the breeze, casting eerie shadows against the stone, as through the very fabric of the empire itself was beginning to unravel. The council chamber was darkened, the air thick with incense, its acrid scent curling like smoke around the gathered elite. Faint shadows danced across polished obsidian walls as the low flicker of braziers cast an eerie light over the men and women seated in rigid silence. A sharp tension hung in the air like a knife poised just above the skin. It was a tension that Kael could taste on the back of his tongue. Expectation, fear, and uncertainty. At the head of the table stood Kael, his figure like a living statue in the dim light. His hands rested lightly on the lacquered surface of the war table, fingers stretched almost lazily, though his golden eyes were sharper every inch the predator circling his prey. Around him sat the brightest minds the empire had to offer, generals, scholars, ministers, men who had survived decades of brutal warfare and political scheming. And yet, despite their experience, none of them could meet his gaze. They understood Kael was the true power in this room. At the far end of the table, Empress Selene sat draped in her imperial gold, a vision of controlled grace. Though her robes shimmered with opulence, it was the quiet tension in her posture that spoke volumes. She was regal, but it was clear who held the reins of this council. She did not need to speak. Her silence was an acknowledgement of the shifting power that now resided with Kael. A thick, uneasy quiet enveloped the chamber as Kael's voice broke through the air like a sword slicing through the stillness. "Every battle is fought twice," he began, his tone low but intense. "Once with blades, and once with minds. The prophet, he wins before the sword is ever drawn." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. The room shifted uncomfortably. Lord Valen, a veteran general with scars older than most of those present, leaned forward, his brow furrowing in frustration. "We've altered formations, shifted troops, even changed cipher protocols. He still outpaces us." His voice was strained, as though each word was a painful admission of defeat. Kael's gaze, already sharp, seemed to sharpen even further. His eyes flickered with a dangerous light. "Because you're reacting." He predicts reactions. "You're playing chess while he's already rewritten the rules." His voice held no hint of doubt, only certainty, a certainty that sent a shiver down the spine of everyone in the room. A cold hush descended over the council. It was as though they had all realized the grim truth at the same time. The prophet was no ordinary adversary. He had seen through their strategies, predicted their movements, and already set his pieces in place. They were the ones reacting, are always one step behind. Selene's voice, smooth and dangerous, broke the silence. Her words were measured, but there was an edge to them, a quiet challenge. "And what rules will you write, Kael?" A slow smile curled on Kael's lips. It was a smile that held no warmth, only a chilling promise. "None," he said, each word deliberate and final. "From now on, we fight with chaos." The room froze. Some blinked in confusion. Others sat straighter, an understanding dawning on them. Chaos. To Kael, war was not about predictability, not about following the same old patterns. It was about control, and to control chaos was to control the game entirely. The concept was radical, unsettling. But in Kael's eyes, it was the only way to break the prophet's grasp on the empire. Within the hour, the traditional council was disbanded. Only Kael's most trusted operatives remained, his shadow dancers, deep agents, and field commanders. These were the ones who thrived in the unorthodox, the unpredictable. These were the ones who would ensure that the Empire's new war was not just fought with blood and steel but with the very fabric of reality itself. Kael stood before them, his hands folded behind his back as he surveyed the room. His eyes were bright, focused, each movement measured, deliberate. "No more predictability," he began. His voice was low, but there was an undeniable force behind it. "We move like a creature with shifting heads, erratic, untethered, insane to anyone trying to chart us. He turned to Captain Silas, a master of misinformation and deception, his face a mask of stoic resolve. Feed the East false intelligence. Let them believe we retreat. Disguise mercenaries as deserters. Let them see the cracks they so desperately seek. Silas gave a single, sharp nod, the plan already forming in his mind. Kael turned next to Lady Raven, a blade dancer and master infiltrator. Her movements were like liquid, quick and precise, her mind a labyrinth of deception. Whisper betrayal into their ranks, Kael commanded. So dissent. If their prophet trusts minds, let's poison those minds. Raven's smile was dangerous, knowing it will be done. Finally, Kael turned to General Cassius, a man who had been tempered in the fires of war and whose reputation was built on brutal, unrelenting force. His hands gripped the hilt of his sword like a lever. I want a reckless assault, Kael continued, his voice steady, unwavering. Loud, bloody. A failure that screams desperation. Let them believe we are unraveling. When they come to finish you, sir. Cassius bared his teeth, the hunger for battle clear in his eyes. We greet them with knives behind every shadow. Kael nodded, a single motion that conveyed approval. Good. That evening, the Imperial Gardens were bathed in soft moonlight, the lotus pond reflecting the pale light like a mirror. The air was cool, but Celine's thoughts burned hotter than any flame. She stood at the edge of the pond, her reflection fragmented by the ripples. The garden was eerily still, the silence only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. And then, she felt the sudden, undeniable presence of Kael behind her. You're quiet, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. She turned, meeting his gaze. There was a tension in her eyes, a flicker of something that was neither approval nor disapproval, simply acknowledgement. You make war sound like poetry, like ear-broken bar theater, she said, her voice soft, yet edged with something darker, something uncertain. Kael took a step closer, the faintest smirk on his lips. Because it is. The difference is, in my version, I write the final act. She didn't flinch. But there was something in her gaze now, something dangerous, something unreadable. She tilted her head slightly, studying him under the silvery light. And if I one day decide I don't like the ending? Kael stepped even closer, his presence consuming the space between them. His hand brushed against the marble railing, his fingers grazing hers. His touch was deliberate and not tender, but possessive. His voice dropped to a murmur. Then I'll rewrite you, too. The air between them crackled with tension. Neither of them spoke again for a long moment. The silence stretched, as though the very world held its breath, waiting for something to give. But neither of them flinched. Neither moved away. There was no fear in Celine's eyes, only the faintest glimmer of something far more dangerous. By dawn, the Empire had shifted. It was no longer a machine of carefully calculated steps, of predictable movements. The false retreats, the sudden strikes, the internal sabotage. It was all part of the plan. The game had changed, and no one, not even the prophet, could see it coming. Far to the north, in the icy heart of the hidden faction's stronghold, a robed figure sat before a massive map illuminated only by the soft flicker of candlelight. Pins and markers moved across the map with a delicate touch, guided by invisible hands. The prophet's fingers hovered just above the map, his breath stilled, his gaze unwavering. Something was wrong. The pattern he had so carefully constructed, so precise, so predictably, was falling apart before his eyes. It was unraveling, like smoke slipping through fingers. He could feel it in the very air, in the silence that enveloped him. No symmetry, he murmured, his voice tight with growing uncertainty. No, a broken bar rhythm. His gaze locked onto the flickering flame of the candle. His mind raced as his fingers hovered over the markers, each one representing a move, a decision, a pattern he had anticipated. But now, there was nothing. The future was a blur, and that terrified him. He had never known fear until now. He's come. For the first time, the future was unclear, and that terrified him. The torches lining the long, cold corridor flickered restlessly, casting ghostly shadows across the ancient stone walls, which seemed to breathe with a history of battles fought and alliances broken. Every step Kael took echoed with purpose, his golden eyes reflecting the dim light, sharp and calculating. The air in the Empire was thick with tension. The metallic scent of steel mingled with the earthy undertones of battle preparations outside the castle walls. Distant clashes from drills reverberated through the ground, and murmured conversations buzzed like low thunder, all leading to one inescapable truth: the storm was coming. Kael entered the war chamber, a room designed not for comfort but for strategy, where the weight of the Empire's future rested on decisions made in the coldest of hours. Here, the true weapons of the Empire gathered. Not soldiers, but Nemesa vessels of power, each carrying its own history, its own blood, its own brand of ruthlessness. Cassius, the brute force of Kael's command, stood silently by the far wall, the dark contours of his figure barely visible in the shadows, but his presence undeniably a mountain of muscle and scar tissue. Lady Raven, his most dangerous operative, sat cross-legged atop the polished table, her slender fingers tracing the hilt of a dagger, the blade flashing as she spun it with deadly grace. Silas, the master of misinformation and deceit, stood motionless near the door, his sharp gaze taking in every detail of the room as though he could hear even the smallest shift of air. Kael did not need to speak to command Respector. His mere presence was enough to silence the room. The minds around him, once restless, had quieted, for in his silence lay the promise of destruction, the kind that could break armies and entire kingdoms without a single sword drawn. He seated himself at the head of the table, his golden eyes like twin flames in the darkness. The silence stretched, hanging heavily between them. "The prophet is no longer calm," Kael said, his voice smooth, every word measured, every inflection precise. "Our chaos has poisoned his vision. He stumbles in the dark, forced to react. And that a broken bar makes him human." The air in the room thickened as the weight of Kael's words sank in. Cassius cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing like the rumble of thunder. "So, when do we crack the bone?" Kael's gaze flicked to Silas. "What have we learned?" Silas nodded, his voice a quiet murmur. "Their troops are pulling to Veltha's Ridge. They believe we are massing for a full assault. They'll be waiting, ready for a counterattack." A slow, dangerous smile tugged at the corner of Kael's lips. "Then the net is closing." Raven, always the perceptive one, stilled her blade with one last twirl, the polished steel flashing in the torchlight. "You're going after the prophet, aren't you?" Kael's eyes gleamed with the cold, predatory light. "We strike the head, the body will rot on its own." Cassius's grin widened, his teeth sharp as knives. "Finally, a war worth the blood." Night had fallen, but the air felt too still, too heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The moon hid behind thick clouds, and the forest surrounding Veltha's Ridge whispered in languages older than men, its secrets carried on the wind. Kael and his team moved through the shadows with a fluidity that made them seem as though they belonged to the darkness itself, a phantoms, unseen and unheard. This was not a battle for banners or honor. This was a ghost war, one waged in silence and deception. Kael's movements were precise, each step calculated with the care of a spider spinning a web. Raven moved beside him like a wraith, her eyes flashing as she surveyed their surroundings, every muscle in her body coiled and ready to strike. Cassius was a shadow in the night, moving with the deadly grace of a predator on the hunt. Silas, ever the ace in the back of the operation, lingered at the rear, always watching, always listening, always thinking. They reached the base of Veltha's Ridge, the jagged peaks rising like broken teeth against the darkened sky. Somewhere within its heart, the prophet waited. Kael could feel the pull of his mind, the quiet hum of their conflict to a war not fought with steel, but with minds and hearts. He raised a hand, and the group froze. "Cassius," Kael commanded, his voice a whisper in the still night. "Break their teeth on the eastern gate." Loud, reckless. Cassius's grin returned, full of savage anticipation. "Understood." With a growl, he disappeared into the shadows, the sound of his heavy steps vanishing into the night. Kael turned to Raven. "Purge their western scouts. Leave only whispers behind." She inclined her head, her eyes gleaming with deadly focus. "It will be done." Finally, Kael turned to Silas. "With me." Together, they slipped past the sentries, moving through the unseen corridors of the prophet's stronghold like blades cutting through the dark. Each step was measured, each movement a careful whisper. Nothing could betray them, not the sound of their footsteps, not the rustle of their clothing, not the beat of their hearts. They reached the final corridor, a long, narrow passage colder than stone had a right to be. The air itself felt wrong here, thick with the scent of old magic and twisted purpose. The door at the end of the hall was a mass of etched iron, symbols of power and ancient wards burning faintly across its surface. Kael placed his palm on the door, and it hissed open, the locks unraveling with a sound like frightened serpents. Inside, the only light came from a single brazier, its flickering flame casting shadows that danced like the last remnants of forgotten souls. And there, at the center of the room, stood the prophet, cloaked in obsidian robes, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural, unsettling calm. His presence was like a weight pressing on the air, a force that bent the world around him. "You've come," the prophet said, his voice like silk, smooth, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. Kael stepped into the room, his golden eyes fixed on the figure before him, unwavering, unblinking. "The game is over." The prophet smiled, but it was a smile without warmth, a smile that held within it the promise of something darker. "No," he said softly, his voice stretching like the echo of a distant dream. "It's just begun." He raised his hand, and in that moment, the world shattered. Void. Kael found himself standing in a place where nothing made sense. Colors bled together like oil and madness, swirling and crashing into one another in an endless, kaleidoscopic nightmare. There was no ground beneath him, no sky above here, only the hum of forgotten thoughts, echoes of memories long buried, and a scream of silence that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Across the void, the prophet hovered, his form shifting, stretching, arms spread wide like a twisted saint or a grotesque spider preparing to ensnare its prey. "Do you see, Kael?" he asked, his voice resonating in the emptiness. "This is where wars are truly fought, not in trenches, but in truths, not in wounds, but in perception." Kael's voice broke through the oppressive silence, cold and unwavering. "Then you've already lost." The prophet's smile widened, a grotesque thing that made Kael's stomach tighten. Shadows rose from the depths of the void, alive and hungry, slithering toward Kael, wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. Whispers clawed at his mind, his own doubts, his darkest memories, twisted and distorted into weapons of manipulation. Kael closed his eyes, reaching inward, not for the rage that burned in his veins, but for the core of him that could not be shaken, the stillness beneath the storm. When his eyes opened again, they were golden and brilliant, burning with an intensity that cut through the dark. A single thought erupted from his mind, sharper than any sword. It sliced through the illusions, through the shadows that clung to him like a second skin. The void cracked, the darkness screeched in pain, and the fabric of reality tore apart. Kael was standing again, stone beneath his feet, firelight flickering around him. Silas was groaning on the ground, struggling to rise, his face twisted with confusion and pain. The prophet, too, was retreating, his first, and possibly only, retreat. Kael smiled, the expression as cold and perfect as a sharpened blade. "You'll need more than shadows to stop me." The prophet's voice, softer now, held an edge of frustration. "Then the real war begins now." Before Kael could respond, the prophet vanished like a whisper carried away by the wind, fading into the unseen corners of the world. Kael stood still, his eyes narrowing, the quiet of the chamber pressing in around him. Silas groaned again, rising behind him. "That," Silas rasped, "was not normal." "No," Kael replied, his voice low and dangerous. "It wasn't." And in that moment, Kael knew the real enemy had just revealed itself. The night hung over the empire like a blade waiting to fire, silent, cold, and full of hidden malice. From the highest balcony of his war fortress, Kael stood alone, golden eyes fixed on the ridges where the prophet had vanished. The air was laced with ash and iron, and the faint smoke of distant fires rose like ghosts from the field. The battle that had raged through the night was far from over, its echoes stretching out across the land in whispers, warnings, and promises of more to come. Kael did not look away. He had faced illusions so potent they threatened to breach the boundary of reality itself. Yet, here he stood unbroken, enlightened. The prophet's grasp on perception had faltered. Kael had glimpsed through the veil, seen the mind behind the mask. It was a dangerous thing to make an enemy of someone like Kael, a man whose power lay not in brute force but in his unrivaled capacity for understanding of both the battlefield and the minds of those who sought to control it. The prophet had played his game, twisted the fabric of reality, but Kael had learned something essential. And he knew no matter how elusive the prophet seemed he would find him. He always found his prey. Behind him, the soft echo of footsteps reached Kael's ears, each one deliberate, controlled. They did not belong to a servant or a soldier. Kael didn't turn, knowing who it was before the figure even spoke. Raven emerged from the shadows, her long cloak flowing behind her like smoke in the night. Her sharp eyes studied Kael. She closed the distance between them, the faintest hint of amusement in her voice as she spoke. "The scouts have returned," she said, her voice low, carrying a weight of quiet urgency. Kael did not turn to face her. His gaze remained fixed on the rig lines where the prophet had once stood. His mind was already several steps ahead, calculating, observing. He absorbed every detail, the faint glimmers of movement on the horizon, the traces of energy left behind by the man who had warped the fabric of reality. "And?" he asked, his voice flat, without inflection. "Nothing," Raven replied, her tone clipped. "The prophet is gone. No trace. Not even a whisper. As if he simply ceased to exist." She paused, eyes narrowing. "It's a broken bar." Unsettling. Kael's lips twitched, a smile without warmth. "No one disappears without leaving ripples. Even shadows betray movement if you know where to look." Raven's gaze remained steady. "You already have a plan, I presume?" Kael turned to face her now, his golden eyes gleaming with an unreadable emotion, a mixture of frustration and clarity. His lips curled into a cold smile. "When don't I?" Hours later, the ancient watchtower at the Empire's southern edge came alive with quiet urgency. Lanterns enchanted with glowing sigils flickered above the massive war table, casting shifting shadows across the parchment maps that lay before them. The room hummed with the tension of the coming storm, the weight of strategy pressing down on all those gathered within. Kael stood at the center of the room, his silhouette cast long and powerful beneath the wavering light. Around him, the members of his inner circle took their places. Cassius, a mountain of muscle and barely contained violence, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes dark with anticipation. Raven, silent and lethal, perched on the edge of the table, her fingers tracing the sharp edges of a dagger she had yet to relinquish. Silas, pale but ever watchful, leaned against the far wall, his sharp gaze flicking from face to face, assessing, always analyzing. Kael surveyed the room, his mind sharp as a blade, before his gaze fell upon the map before him. 3 marked points are locations of sudden unrest, unexplained movements, and unusual silences. Each one a potential thread of the prophet's influence, threads that had been woven into the fabric of the Empire, left behind in his wake like the strands of a spider's web. "The prophet is not running," Kael said at last, his voice low but resolute. "He's repositioning." "The prophet does not fight like men do. He doesn't care for the clash of swords and shields. His war is fought on a different plane. He sows chaos through perception, manipulating belief to shape the world as he sees fit." Raven's eyes narrowed, her focus unwavering. "He's not playing war, he's playing legend." Kael nodded slowly, his fingers tapping against the edge of the table. "Exactly. He knows how to shape history, how to turn a rumor into a sword, a myth into an army." He paused, his expression hardening. "And that is why we must not fight him like mere men. We cannot allow ourselves to be tethered to reality as it is. We must strike like myths or like the gods themselves." A heavy silence fell over the room as the weight of Kael's words settled into the minds of his inner circle. Silas, ever the skeptic, gave a quiet scoff. "Myth or not, I don't care for his games. That thing a broken bar, it wasn't human. And I doubt anything short of a god will end it." Cassius leaned forward, the sharp glint of his gauntlets scraping against the wood. "So, what's the play?" "We can't wait for him to make the first move. We need to act now, before he sets the world on fire with his lies." Kael's voice rang clear, cutting through the tension. We strike first, hard, fast, before his influence can take root. We will dismantle the illusions before they take root in the minds of the people. We won't wait for the fire to spread, or we will snuff it out in the cradle. Cassius grinned, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. Finally, something worth the blood. When do we move? Later that night, as the world outside lay shrouded in darkness, Kael sat alone in the private solitude of his chambers. His mind moved faster than the ink on the parchment, faster than the rebellion whispers stirring on the wind. The reports laid out before him were nothing more than pieces of a puzzle he would solve before dawn. The flickering light of the hearth cast dancing shadows across the room, shifting and warping with every small breath of wind. For a moment, Kael allowed himself to relax, if only for a fleeting second. And that was when he felt a subtle, but undeniable presence. Not movement, but a presence, a disruption in the calm. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. Without turning, he poured himself a glass of crimson wine, savoring the moment before speaking, his voice carrying without effort. "You could have knocked." A soft, sultry laugh reached his ears, rich as velvet and thick with promise. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall, regal, and as deadly as the night itself. Empress Selene. Her raven black hair tumbled like silk down her back, and her crimson eyes glimmered like molten embers, filled with secrets long kept. She moved with the grace of a serpent, slow, deliberate, and utterly mesmerizing. Kael's golden gaze met hers, unwavering. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Selene's lips curled into a smile, one that promised 1,000 unspoken things. "You intrigue me, Lord Kael," she purred, her voice low and dangerous. "Few men do." Kael took a slow sip of his wine, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm sure your court is full of intrigue." She took a single step forward, closing the distance between them until there was only the faintest breath separating them. "None that hold power," she replied, her voice dropping an octave as she continued to glide closer. "Not like you. I've watched your rise. I see the precision with which you manipulate. The way you turn generals into pawns and myths into stepping stones. I see the strings you pull, even in the dark." Kael tilted his head slightly, studying her with sharp eyes. "And what does the Empress desire from a puppeteer?" Selene stopped just shy of him, her body poised like a weapon waiting to strike. She gazed up at him, her crimson eyes gleaming with dangerous intent. "To join him," she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. "Before the world realizes who truly sits upon the throne." The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, charged with the promise of power, of a future forged in the shadows of their desires. Kael's voice dropped to a low whisper, his words carrying a weight that could not be ignored. "Then let's write the ending together." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Selene's lips, her eyes gleaming with something more than mere attraction, as something far darker, far more intoxicating. Outside, the rumble of thunder echoed through the empire, like the beginning of a storm that would tear through everything in its path. Kael remained unmoved, ever calculating, ever ready to take the next step toward his ultimate goal. Nothing would stand in his way. Not the prophet, not the empress, not anyone. The throne was his, and soon, everyone would know it. The chamber was bathed in the soft, flickering glow of candles, their flames stretching and twisting across the room, casting long, jagged shadows on the obsidian walls. The coldness of the stone seemed to bite at the air, yet within the heart of the room, a quiet tension simmered, and unseen, but felt by all who dared to enter. The stillness, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire in the hearth, was a silence that hummed with the weight of the moments to come. Kael sat at the center, a man of calculating precision, his golden eyes glinting in the dim light. His posture was relaxed, yet there was a sharpness to his presence that could cut through the thickest of veils. His fingers, steepled together in front of him, rested on the surface of the worn oak table before him, a silent testament to his control over the unfolding chaos around him. His mind, sharp as ever, was already weaving the threads of the future. Across from him stood Empress Selene, a woman whose very presence seemed to bend the air around her. Dressed in a gown black as the night, it clung to her form with an elegance that bordered on predatory. The crimson of her eyes, burning like the embers of a long-forgotten fire, locked with his, and in that instant, There was no doubt this was a woman who was both his equal and his opposite. A dangerous combination. Her voice broke the silence, smooth and velvety, but laced with an undercurrent of something darker. "You don't seem surprised to see me." Kael didn't even flinch. His gaze never wavered from her, calculating, assessing. He took a sip from the goblet in front of him, the crimson liquid swirling in the dim light, before placing it down gently, as if savoring the brief moment of peace before the storm. "A queen never moves without purpose," he replied, his tone calm and even. "A king, on the other hand, anticipates her moves." 2 steps ahead. Celine's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, a smirk that spoke of both admiration and challenge. "Is that what you are now?" "A king?" Kael leaned back in his chair, his posture still perfect, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not yet," he said, his voice as cold as the stone that surrounded them. "But I'm clearing the board. And when the time comes, I will be ready to claim what is mine." Celine moved then, her steps slow and measured, as though each one was part of some intricate dance only she could understand. Her heels clicked softly against the polished stone floor, a sound that was almost imperceptible, yet it seemed to echo through the stillness of the room. She circled him, her movements predatory, but graceful, like a predator enjoying the hunt. Her eyes never left his, burning with a fire that matched the intensity of his own. "You play this game well, Kael," she said, her voice soft but rich with meaning. "Better than most." "And yet," Kael murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "you're still here." "That means you're either impressed or desperate." She laughed then, the sound dark and melodic, carrying with it a touch of danger. "Perhaps both," she said, pausing just inches away from him, her gaze never wavering. "Perhaps I am both impressed and desperate." Her perfume, a dark, intoxicating blend of rose and something older, something almost divine, wafted toward him as she stepped closer. The scent lingered in the air, filling his senses, but it did not distract him. He remained focused, every fiber of his being tuned to the conversation unfolding before him. Celine's voice was a whisper now, almost a caress. "The prophet's shadow creeps through my empire. Ministers whisper in corridors they once feared to walk. My enemies, once trembling, now gain courage. And I despise courage in the hands of fools." Kael's golden eyes narrowed slightly, his voice still calm, but with a cutting edge to it. "You want me to sever the root before it has a chance to strangle your throne?" Celine's smile turned wicked, her lips curling into something almost dangerous. "I want him eradicated. Utterly. No ashes, no legacy. I want him erased from existence here so completely that no one will even remember his name." She leaned forward then, placing a single hand on the armrest of his chair, her face now inches from his. The warmth of her body was almost overwhelming, but Kael didn't flinch. Instead, he allowed her proximity to linger, his gaze never faltering. "And I want to do it with you," she finished, her voice low and laden with meaning. Kael did not move. His golden eyes locked with hers, unblinking. He remained still, his mind already working, calculating the next step, the next move. "And what do I gain from burning your enemies to the ground?" he asked, his voice even, but laced with curiosity. Celine met his gaze unflinchingly, her expression unwavering. "Power," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "Influence. A hand on the scepter when the dust clears. I offer no leash, only partnership. A true partnership." Kael's eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest flicker of amusement crossing his face. "You assume I desire the throne?" She laughed softly, the sound rich and dark. "No, Kael," she replied, her gaze never leaving his. "You want everything that lies behind it, the control, the legacy, the power to shape the world in your image. And I want a man beside me who does not tremble when I speak." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, a promise, and an unspoken agreement all at once. It was the kind of pact that didn't need to be spoken aloud, for both of them knew what it meant. It was a partnership forged not in ink or blood, but in ambition, in shared goals, and in mutual respect for each other's power. There was no need for more words. Kael rose from his seat, his movements deliberate and slow. He stepped closer to her, his presence commanding. His voice dropped to a whisper, low and dangerous. "If we do this, it's not as ruler and servant. It's as wolves, Selene. Equal, unbound, ruthless. Selene's crimson eyes flared with something fierce, a glimmer of something dangerous, something delighted. Her lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile. "Then we are of the same breed," she said, her voice a purr. And with that, the pact was made, not in ink, not in blood, but in shared ambition, in the knowledge that each of them had much to gain and that neither would hesitate to strike if the other faltered. The sun rose the following morning, casting a golden light over Kael's war fortress. He stood atop the eastern battlements, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Below, his army moved with clockwork precision, soldiers, spies, shadow binders, and mercenaries, all working together under his unyielding command. He could feel the power coursing through his veins, the weight of destiny pressing against his shoulders. He had built this empire with his mind, with his cunning, and with his sheer will. And now, with Selene by his side, the future seemed even more within his grasp. Raven stepped beside him, her dark cloak billowing in the wind as she regarded the army below. "You made a deal with her," she observed, her tone quiet, but sharp with interest. Kael didn't look at her, his golden eyes still fixed on the horizon. "She made a deal with me," he corrected, his voice calm and measured. "And for now, that serves both our interests." Raven's eyes narrowed slightly. "And do you trust her?" Kael's lips curled into a faint, amused smile. "I trust her to act in her best interest. For now, that serves mine." Raven remained silent for a moment, her gaze still fixed on the army below. "And the prophet?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Kael's gaze turned colder, his eyes burning brighter as his mind shifted into focus. "The prophet believes he manipulates the board," he said, his voice low, venomous with the weight of unspoken power. "But the fool never stopped to ask." He paused, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "Who built it?" The wind picked up, howling across the battlements as Kael stared into the distance, the shadows of war gathering on the horizon, and the game of gods and kings continued to unfold. The grand city of Ortlis, the heart of the empire, shimmered beneath the amber glow of morning light. Its obsidian spires, tall and sharp as the edges of daggers, caught the rising sun, reflecting the molten brilliance as though the city itself was a weapon of gods. But beneath the marble streets, the veins of power, and the sacred towers where emperors once stood, unrest slithered like a serpent coiled in the dark. The prophet's whispers had taken root in the very bones of the empire. The discontented, the desperate, the lost souls clinging to shattered ideals, so they heard his voice in every dark corner. His promises of salvation and revolution had bloomed like a poisonous flower, and the roots of his influence dug deep into the minds of the people. Kael walked the imperial palace's grand corridors with deliberate steps, his cloak trailing like a shadow at his heels, every movement calculated, each footfall heavy with purpose. His golden eyes, cold as molten metal, scanned the faces of courtiers who bowed in his wake, not from loyalty, but from fear. The kind of fear that kept them aware of his power, of the dominion he wielded over their fragile lives. Recognition, not of a man, but of a force too dangerous to defy. At his side, Empress Selene moved with a grace that was both captivating and terrifying. Her every step was deliberate, each glance cast with an air of regal command. Yet Kael, ever perceptive, noticed the faintest shift in her posture. The slight rigidity of her shoulders, the calculated control in the way she met his gaze. It was fear, but not of death. It was the fear of irrelevance, of being outmaneuvered. He knew it well, that fear of a ruler who realizes their grip on the throne is slipping. They entered the High Council chamber, a magnificent dome of gold-veined obsidian that loomed like a hollow eye over the court. The room was filled with the empire's ministers, lords, and strategists. Some were cloaked in the velvet of power, others in the fabric of scheming. All wore masks of diplomacy, but beneath those masks, Kael could see their true faces, the faces of men and women who feared change, who feared the shifting of the tide. He could feel the weight of their eyes, assessing him, weighing his every move. A man stepped forward from the assembly. His robes were a deep crimson, richly adorned with sigils of ancient gods, gods that had long since been abandoned by all but the zealots. He did not bow. His gaze, unwavering and confident, pierced the room. His voice, deep and smooth, poured over the assembly like dark silk. "The empire drifts, your majesty," he began, his words like a soft echo of rebellion. The people seek purpose, not puppets. They no longer kneel to titles born of conquest. The room went still. Kael's golden eyes narrowed slightly, every muscle in his body taut with awareness. The prophet, he knew that name well. His influence had spread through the empire like a disease, infecting not just the people, but even those closest to the throne. His message of a new world order, one free of the emperor's iron fist, had captivated the masses. Selene, ever the queen, straightened, her sharp voice cutting through the tension. They will kneel to strength. And they will remember who brought peace while others promised illusions. She said it with the authority of a ruler who had crushed rebellion with her bare hands. But Kael could sense the uncertainty beneath the surface. The seeds of doubt had already been sown. The prophet's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile without warmth, a smile that sent a chill through the room. Peace born of fear is not peace. It is delay. I offer revelation. A world freed from chains are yours among them. Kael stepped forward, his presence commanding. His voice, calm and deliberate, broke the silence. You speak of liberation, but your methods are shadows in disguise. Revolt wrapped in scripture. You do not guide. You incite. The prophet's eyes flashed with something dangerous, a confidence, perhaps, or the arrogance of someone who believed he was destined for more. And yet a broken bar they listen. Ask yourself why, Lord Kael. When men fear kings, they obey. But when they believe gods walk among them, a broken bar they follow. The room seemed to shrink in that moment. Kael could feel the tension crackling in the air. A dangerous idea, not a man, but a myth, a god amongst men. The prophet was not just a threat. He was an idea, a movement, an ideology that would be harder to defeat than any sword. Selene's sharp intake of breath was the only sign of the storm brewing beneath her cool exterior. In the quiet that followed, she finally spoke, her voice colder than Kael had ever heard it. He's wormed his way into my provinces. Even my generals question which crown holds true authority. Kael remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the map that lay spread out before them. His fingers danced lightly across the parchment, tracing lines and symbols with a care that suggested both deep thought and the calmness of someone who knew they controlled the game. He took the goblet of wine from her hand, setting it aside with deliberate slowness. Then remind them. Not with fire but with doubt. Selene arched a brow, surprised by the suggestion. An idea is not so easily slain. Kael smiled faintly, a smile that did not reach his eyes. But it can be unmade. His voice grew even lower, the room seemingly narrowing around them as Kael outlined his strategy. The prophet's power does not lie in his words alone. It lies in the faith he has cultivated, the faith of the masses. If we break the belief, we break him. Operation Silence Fire was born that night. A quiet, insidious strike at the very foundation of the prophet's movement. Kael's agents, hand-picked for their loyalty and their ability to blend into the shadows, began their work. They infiltrated the prophet's sermons, carefully planting seeds of doubt, whispered contradictions, subtle contradictions in his teachings, discreet rumors of betrayal, of hidden agendas. They moved through the speaker's circles, finding the most ardent of his followers, and turning them into spies, informers, and double agents. But Kael knew that was not enough. The prophet had spread his influence too far. So, Kael went deeper. The pillars of faith, ancient and sacred monoliths that stood at the center of the empire, once quiet and revered relics, had now become symbols of the prophet's growing power. Under his sermons, they pulsed with new meaning, resonating with the voices of his believers. Kael would twist that symbolism, break it, and turn it back on him. Selene's re-sanctification ceremony, held in the heart of the imperial cathedral of the prophet's own domain, would be the stage for the final act. It was an audacious plan, but Kael knew it would send a message far more potent than any assassination or open conflict ever could. It was time for the prophet to witness the power of belief shattered in an instant. On the night of the ceremony, the city of Vortlis was alive with anticipation. Torches lit the streets like veins of fire, the people gathering beneath the pillars of faith, their collective breath caught in expectation. A ritual, a celebration of power, of divinity. But little did they know that they were about to be shown a very different truth. From the highest tower of the imperial palace, Kael stood, watching the city breathe below him. Raven joined him, her cloak fluttering in the wind as she gazed out across the horizon. "You're lighting a match in a powder chamber," she remarked, her voice a mixture of caution and admiration. Kael didn't turn. His golden eyes remained fixed on the scene below. "I'm showing them who holds the flame." Raven hesitated before speaking again. "And if he counters?" Kael's eyes glinted with fire, his voice low but filled with unshakable confidence. "Then I'll bury him in ash." The first blow had been struck not with the blade, but with truth. The truth was far more lethal than any weapon. Kael's agents had planted the seeds of doubt, and now, like a blade in the dark, the prophet's faith would begin to unravel. The prophet had made his gambit. His forces, his followers, his carefully cultivated power, all of it hinged on belief. And Kael was about to reshape the game board entirely. On this battlefield of belief, Kael would not merely survive, he would reign. The night air hung thick with the weight of incense and anticipation, a heady mix that seemed to permeate the very stones of the city. Across the Imperial Plaza, thousands stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising in the cool air like an army of whispers. The once proud stone of Vortlis, with its labyrinth of marble streets and towering spires, now felt like a cage, waiting to be broken. The city, glimmering beneath the light of 1,000 torches, seemed alive with tension, a pulse that quickened with every moment. From his vantage atop the marble balcony of the Imperial Palace, Kael surveyed the scene with quiet intensity. Below him, the crowd was a writhing mass, a sea of faces lit by the flickering flame of the torches. He could hear the low hum of conversation rising from the masses, a chorus of voices that ranged from devotion to doubt. The people, the lifeblood of the empire, were restless. Kael's gaze narrowed, eyes scanning the plaza below, noting the way the crowd shifted, swayed, even in the dim light. They were like a storm, each individual no more than a leaf on the wind, uncertain, pulled in 1,000 different directions. But Kael, ever the strategist, saw more. He saw their hearts, their desires, hope, hunger, and an overwhelming ache of disillusionment. "Faith is the most fragile of chains," Kael thought to himself, his voice a silent whisper in the midst of the noise. "It is so easily shattered, with the right fracture. All it takes is a whisper, a seed planted in the mind. And then, everything changes." He shifted his gaze slightly, his eyes settling on the platform erected in the center of the plaza. Empress Selene stood at its center, framed by a web of glowing sigils that seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy. Her crimson robes, trimmed with night-black silk, fluttered in the breeze, but her poise remained unshaken. She looked every inch the sovereign, a queen who commanded the attention of all around her. But even Kael, with his sharp instincts, could sense the tremor beneath her perfect exterior. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something else, something deeper. A flicker of uncertainty. Her resolve was steel, but Kael knew how easily steel could break. As she began to speak, her voice rang out across the plaza, amplified by the enchantment cast amplifiers. It was clear and commanding, yet with an underlying softness, a humanity that reached out to the people. "Loyal subjects of the Emperor Broken Bar," she began, her voice carrying far across the sea of faces. Her words hung in the air, heavy with expectation. "I do not speak as your empress tonight," Selene continued, letting the silence stretch between them, her tone sharp as a blade's edge. "I speak as your daughter, a woman of this land, one who bleeds as you do." A hush descended over the crowd. Even the torches seemed to burn with more intensity, as though they too hung on her every word. The subtle weight of her speech, her claim to the people, her plea for connection, was a calculated move. It was not just a proclamation of power, it was a challenge to the prophet's authority, to his claims of divine truth. "Tonight, I stand before you not as your ruler, but as one of you, a woman born of this empire, who has fought beside you all." Her words cut through the night, laced with quiet fury. The prophet speaks of a future, free of tyrants, free of chains. He promises salvation. "But I ask you, Thesa, who is he?" The words were a sharp blow to the hearts of the crowd. Murmurs spread like wildfire, as eyes darted toward one another, seeking answers. Doubt, like poison, spread among them. Some still held fast to their faith, but others, those who had never fully embraced the prophet's teachings, began to question. "Where was this chosen one when the monsters clawed at our borders?" Selene continued, her voice now thick with the weight of history. "When our soldiers froze in the mountains to keep the invaders at bay, so you could live in peace. When your children cried in hunger, and the empire fed them." She paused, letting the word settle in the air. The crowd shifted again, their discomfort palpable. Some looked at one another, uncertainty creasing their brows. The seeds of doubt had been planted. And then, the first fracture appeared. A hooded figure emerged from the crowd. His movements were deliberate, slower, each step calculated. He made his way toward the platform, and though no guards moved to stop him, Kael could see the shift in the atmosphere. The air seemed to still, like the calm before a storm. Murmurs ran through the crowd, and Kael's sharp eyes caught the flicker of recognition in the faces of some of the onlookers. The man reached the platform and drew back his hood in one fluid motion, revealing his face to the sea of onlookers. Brother Edrin, once the prophet's voice in the capital, once beloved, revered, seen as the true mouthpiece of the divine, but now a broken bow, broken. Trembling, his face, gaunt and worn, was shadowed with guilt, his eyes wide with fear and remorse. The gasps from the crowd were deafening, a collective intake of breath, a shared realization that something fundamental had just shifted. Edrin fell to his knees, his hands trembling as they rose toward the heavens. His voice cracked with raw emotion. "I have sinned," he began, his words barely a whisper but carrying the weight of 1,000 broken promises. "I have followed a lie." The crowd went silent, their collective breath held, waiting for the truth that had just been offered to them. "I followed the prophet, and I believed in his words," Edrin continued, his voice trembling as though each syllable was a battle. "But what I've learned, what I've seen, a broken bar, it is not salvation he offers. It is manipulation. He speaks not of salvation, but of conquest. He would burn this empire to the ground to build his throne on its ashes." He held up a weathered tome, its pages dripping with cryptic ink. The book was not just any relic, it was the prophet's own, the very text that had guided the faith of thousands. And now, it was exposed for what it truly was, no sacred scripture, but a tool of control, a weapon of deceit. "This is the truth," Edrin said, voice trembling with emotion. "This is the truth the prophet does not want you to know." His words were never divine, yet they were a means to an end. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, rising in a swell of disbelief, anger, and fear. Some shouted in denial, while others seemed paralyzed, their faith crumbling before their eyes. Kael watched from above, his eyes narrowing with cold satisfaction. The seed had been planted, and it was already beginning to take root. Selene stepped forward, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "You must decide what is real. Not by blind devotion, not by fear. Ask yourselves what leader sows division and dares call it salvation." Her words were a challenge, a direct confrontation with the very foundation of the prophet's power. She paused, letting the silence stretch long enough for the weight of her words to sink in. "I will not command your faith," she said softly, her tone firm yet compassionate. "But I will defend your future." The words stung, but they were also a balm, offering the crowd something they hadn't known they needed, the possibility of hope without fear, the possibility of a future without the prophet's twisted influence. Edrin collapsed forward, his body shaking with sobs. But it was not Selene who lifted him, it was the image of hero, a sovereign who listened, who understood, who was willing to offer mercy even in the face of betrayal. Kael turned away from the balcony, his cloak sweeping behind him like a shadow. In the chamber of mirrors within the palace, he stood alone for a moment, removing his gloves, the silence of the room a mirror of the silence that now echoed through the plaza. Raven entered without a word, her gaze sharp, assessing the aftermath of the evening's events. "You broke him," she said quietly, her tone laced with admiration. Kael's smile was cold, distant. "I let truth do the cutting. All I did was place the blade in his hand." "The prophet will retaliate," Raven warned, her voice low, but Kael could hear the edge of concern beneath the calm exterior. "Let him," Kael replied, his voice like ice. "Let him rage. Let him scream. The more noise he makes, the more doubt will echo." The prophet, wherever he was, had already begun to gather his forces, his mind racing as the first cracks in his mask appeared. But Kael was patient. He had never believed in rushing. In time, the prophet's mask would shatter entirely, and when it did, Kael would be there to pick up the pieces. That night, from a distant spire, The prophet watched as the world he had carefully crafted began to crumble. His most trusted disciple, kneeling before the empire, had betrayed him. His holy book, once his greatest weapon, was now exposed for the tool of manipulation it truly was. His grip on the hearts of the people was slipping, and he knew it. "They think this is a crack," the prophet murmured, his voice cold with fury. "Let them think so." He clenched his fist around the carved stone he held, his blood welling from the wound his grip had caused. The pain was nothing. "They've only weakened the mask, a broken bar, not what lies beneath." The throne room stood in oppressive silence, not the reverent stillness of tradition, but the brittle, suffocating hush of an empire on the verge of collapse. The grand hall stretched endlessly, its obsidian floors gleaming under the flickering glow of crystalline chandeliers that seemed to weep their fragile light across the chamber. Gilded marble walls, draped with the banners of past glories and ancient conquests, held the weight of 1,000 years of imperial history. But all that grandeur, all that history, was irrelevant in the moment. The only thing that mattered now was the man at the center of the storm. He stood tall at the heart of the room, his figure a sharp contrast against the opulent surroundings, clad in muted black and silver. No crown adorned his head, for he didn't need such symbols to claim dominion. His very presence, his silence, his unyielding gaze, commanded more authority than any imperial regalia could offer. He was not merely a player on this board, he was the board, the pieces, and the hands that moved them. Every breath in the room, every subtle shift of tension, was for him. A bead of sweat traced down the brow of a merchant seated near the front, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his ceremonial dagger in a desperate attempt to mask his fear. A general stood like a statue, his face fixed, rigid with an effort to keep his composure. Even the high priests, those revered custodians of faith, muttered silent prayers not to the gods, but to their own survival. Kael didn't need to speak to rule the room. The weight of his presence, the suffocating anticipation that seemed to thicken the air, was enough to control them all. And then, as if by some invisible signal, a voice broke the suffocating stillness. "Duke Renard." The aging noble stepped forward with slow, deliberate steps, his regal gait masking the nervousness that danced in his chest. His eyes flicked toward Kael with the careful calculation of a man who had been at court for too long, a man who knew the balance or power had shifted, but had not yet accepted the full scope of that shift. His voice, when it finally emerged, was calculated and laced with authority, but there was a tremor beneath it, an awareness of the risk of antagonizing the storm that now stood before him. "We acknowledge your victories, Lord Kael," Renard said, his words deliberate and thick with the weight of forced civility. He emphasized Kael's title, as if somehow trying to reinforce the distance between them. "Your name has become a storm, unavoidable, yes, but not yet divine. Power may sway a battlefield, but governance is a more delicate art. Should you dictate the course of this council?" The words hung in the air, thick with condescension, and the murmurs that followed were not of approval, but uncertainty. Some nodded in hesitant agreement, while others shifted uneasily in their seats. This was not merely a council, this was a battlefield of words, and Kael had just been called out, the challenge laid bare. Kael smiled. Slowly, deliberately. "Duke Renard," he said, his voice smooth, like silk slipping over a blade, "you speak of governance as if it were not the puppet of power. But allow me a question in turn. Do you still believe this council makes decisions?" The question landed like a hammer on glass. Renard stiffened, his body betraying the insult before his mind could catch up. Kael took a single step forward, his boots clicking against the marble floor, each sound echoing like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. "Governance," Kael continued, his tone dangerously calm, "is not measured in degrees or titles. It is measured in obedience, in fear, in silence." He let the words hang in the air, each syllable like a blade sharpening itself. "Like this one," Kael finished, his gaze sweeping across the room. Not a soul spoke, not a murmur stirred. Even Duke Renard's lips parted, but no words came. Kael moved like a shadow through the stillness, his every movement calculated, deliberate. His eyes flicked over the nobles, the military officers, the priests, all of them relics, all of them creatures of habit, of tradition. They had worn their masks of civility for so long, had believed in the illusion of democracy, of power shared among the elite, that they had forgotten the truth. The truth was simple: they were no longer in charge, and Kael would make sure they knew it. He stepped forward once again, his gaze locking on the throne at the far end of the room. The Empress, Selene. She sat upon the throne like a blade sheathed in velvet. Clad in imperial crimson and dusk gold, she looked every inch the sovereign, but her beauty, like the throne itself, was cold and unreachable, perfect, unassailable. But Kael knew better. Beneath the veneer of flawless elegance, behind those ice-green eyes that always seemed to distance themselves from the world around her, he saw the cracks. He saw the vulnerability that none of her courtiers could detect. She was alone, a queen among leeches, a ruler surrounded by vultures, and tonight, Kael would lay the first stone that would topple her. He moved toward her, closer now, but just far enough to maintain the illusion of decorum. His every step seemed to command the room, as if the very air bent in his presence. He could feel the eyes of the council upon him, feel their collective breath held in anticipation. But none of them mattered, not anymore. He stopped just before the throne, his gaze lifting to meet hers. And then, Kael spoke. "Your Majesty," he said softly, his voice a mixture of velvet and steel, "these men serve only themselves. They offer you counsel, yet poison every cup. But where you deserve to rule without them." Her lips parted, as if to speak, but she didn't. For just a moment, the mask slipped. He saw the flicker of hesitation, the briefest crack in her stoic exterior. She had heard his words. They had reached her. Her fingers clenched tight around the armrest of the throne, betraying her calm. Her gaze, steady as it was, shifted slightly. There was a subtle shift in the tension of her body, a small but significant moment where she weighed his words against the truths she had long tried to avoid. Kael didn't press her. He didn't need to. The seeds of doubt were already planted. He allowed the silence to stretch, as long as he needed. His words, soft as they were, had already been heard. The decision had been made, in her heart if not yet her mind. Behind him, chaos bloomed like the scent of rot. Whispers erupted into full shouts. Alliances fractured in real time, noble houses fracturing as they scrambled to adjust to the shifting power dynamics. Some rushed to Kael's side, eyes wide with fear, desperation hanging thick in the air. Others, loyal to the status quo, shouted accusations of treason, of upending the Empire's traditions, of destroying the very foundation of the Empire. Kael said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words. The room was chaos. The pieces were in motion. But he had already spoken. He had already made his move. The Imperiate's future, its heart, was in his hands now. The game of kings had only just begun. The Empire had been a game of kings for centuries. But tonight, Kael had made it clear. The board belonged to him. The pieces danced to his hand. And the Queen, a broken bar, was listening. The Imperial Council chamber was no longer a seat of order. It was a war zone wrapped in silk and gold. The room, with its towering vaulted ceiling, seemed to stretch endlessly upward, and the thick, polished black marble beneath the feet of the nobles reflected their strained faces. Its pristine surface, once symbolic of unchallenged power, now mirrored the cracks forming in the Empire's foundations. Above, massive golden chandeliers hung like relics of forgotten times, their jewels flickering in the dimmed light, casting shadows that shifted and moved with the tension in the air. Imperial banners, adorned with the symbol of the Empire's ancient bloodlines, fluttered above with the faintest stir of a brazier trapped in the stasis of an empire in decay. This was not a gathering of dignitaries. It was the death knell of an era. And at the center stood Kael. He was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the hall around him. He did not wear the imperial colors. He bore no sigil, no crown. But his presence towered above them all, not by sheer height, but by the unyielding weight of inevitability. His silence was a command that needed no reinforcement. It was the kind of silence that made the very air thick with tension, drawing every eye to him as if he were the sun, and they the helpless planets circling his orbit. Before him, the nobility gathered in a semblance of a united front, but they were little more than scavengers around a feast that no longer belonged to them. Some of them screamed, their voices rising in the futile attempt to rally support or drown out their fear. Others whispered urgently among themselves, eyes darting toward Kael, sizing up their chances of survival. But the wise were silent. They had seen the inevitable unfold before their very eyes. They had recognized the truth. Kael was not born into nobility. He was not made by blood or law. He was forged in intellect, in fire, in the silence that followed victory, and he had come to claim what the bloodlines had failed to protect. The chaos in the room deepened, but the focal point remained Kael. His gaze swept over the council, each noble a mere piece in the larger game he was playing. Their words were dissonant, echoing in the halls like the dying cries of a beast with no more strength to resist. This man undermines every foundationer. He defies the laws of stationer. He poisons the court with chaos. Kael did not flinch. He did not even acknowledge them. His eyes, cold and unblinking, remained fixed ahead. He cataloged each voice as it rose, each plea, each accusation, each desperate attempt to salvage what was left of their crumbling power. Their weaknesses bled through every syllable they spoke. The rot in their hearts became apparent with every passing word. Then a shift. The sound of soft, measured footsteps, echoing like the approach of a storm, interrupted the growing noise. Every head turned as the Empress rose from her throne. And the room died. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim in reverence. The nobles froze, their breath caught in their throats. The guards stilled, their hands poised over their weapons, but none dared make a move. The very walls seemed to lean in, straining to hear the unfolding moment. She descended from her throne with the grace of falling ashes, soft, silent, lethal. Selene, the Empress, was a woman of unrivaled poise. Her emerald gown shimmered with an ethereal glow, like a blade wrapped in moonlight. The silken fabric caught the light in a way that made it appear as if the very stars has been woven into her dress. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests, but the room knew those hands could command armies, shape destinies, end lives with the merest flick. She had ruled longer than many of the men present had lived. She had survived betrayals, coups, assassins, and the shifting tides of politics. She was not a queen by chance, but by mastery. Her survival was a testament to her power, her intelligence, her ruthless ability to remain untouched by the storms that had swallowed countless others. But this was different. This was Kael, the man who had defied every tradition, who had come not as a supplicant, but as a tremor that shook the very ground beneath their feet. She stopped before him. Her eyes met his, emerald locking onto gold. For a moment, the world stood still. "You walk into my court," she said, her voice smooth as silk, but with the edge of steel beneath every word, not as a supplicant but as a tremor. Kael did not flinch. He did not bow. He did not yield. Power recognized power. "You speak no demands, offer no tribute. And yet, the empire bends beneath your shadow," she continued, her voice never faltering, but laced with an undercurrent of something deeper, something dangerous. "A challenge, a test." Kael stepped forward, not in defiance, not with arrogance, but with inevitability. And in that single step, something in the air shifted. Something trembled beneath the surface. The Empress tilted her head ever so slightly, her gaze piercing, as if searching him, measuring him, and finding something she had not expected. She paused. Then, in a voice that carried a hidden promise and a warning all at once, she asked the question that would determine everything. "If I were to acknowledge a broken bar influence," she said, her words carefully weighed, "what would you ask of the Empire?" "A trap, a razor-thin line between life and death, a throne draped in razor wire." Kael did not hesitate. He leaned in, his movements deliberate, slow, controlled. His voice dropped to a whisper, but it was a whisper that carried the weight of kingdoms. "I do not ask for anything, Your Majesty," he said softly. "I merely ensure that when the weight becomes too meek you will know where to lean." Silence. It was a whisper beneath a storm, but it struck like thunder. The court stood in stunned quiet, unable to process the magnitude of the words that had just been spoken. Some gasped, some swallowed hard, as if the very air had been ripped from their lungs. The Empress's gaze did not waver, but something shifted in the depths of her eyes. It was not offense, not anger, not even the faintest trace of indignation. It was intrigue, a sharp, cold curiosity. And that was when Kael knew he had passed her test. And more than that, he had passed the test of the Empire itself. The nobles were left in stunned silence. The court had been fractured, torn apart in a single exchange of words, in a single breath. The mighty, who had once held their power as if it were unshakable, now found themselves beneath Kael's gaze, and they understood, for the first time, that power was not measured in bloodlines. It was not measured in laws or decrees. It was measured in obedience, in fear, in silence. The Empress's lips quirked upward ever so slightly. A smile, subtle, barely there, but it was enough, and for Kael, that was all that mattered. For the Empire no longer belonged to tradition. It no longer belonged to the bloodlines. It no longer belonged to the old men who had once called themselves kings. It belonged to them, to him, and the Empress. Together the chamber hung in a suffocating silence, thick with the tension of words unspoken and actions unmade. It was as if the very walls of the Imperial Council Hall held their breath, caught between what had just transpired and what might come next. The flickering candles in their golden sconces cast trembling shadows over the figures present, adding to the feeling of suspended time, as though the entire world had paused to witness the shift of power. Kael stood unmoving, his posture unyielding, an embodiment of something more than human, or a force that could not be denied. His words had cut through the air, a single stroke of precision that had shattered the far sectionade of order the court had desperately clung to. It was a declaration not of dominance, but of inevitability. And in the profound stillness that followed, Kael understood, he had won. Not a sound came from the assembled nobility. Their expressions were a mix of confusion, fear, and grudging respect. They had long prided themselves on their ability to control, to influence, to govern. But now they were unsure. Kael was not of their blood, not of their lineage, but somehow, impossibly, he was of the same weight as the throne itself. The air crackled with the power that had irrevocably shifted, like a storm rolling in over the horizon, quiet yet inevitable. The Empress, however, remained an island in the center of this tempest. Her eyes were fixed on Kael, as though measuring him, studying him. She had said nothing after his words, so nothing at all, but in that silence, she spoke volumes. She was the heart of this empire, and she had just acknowledged Kael's place at its core. It was not a concession, it was a recognition that the old order was crumbling, and something else was taking its place. For a long moment, she stood there, motionless. Her hands rested delicately on the gilded arms of her obsidian throne, but the stillness betrayed a calculation, a decision made but not yet revealed. The court had gone silent. Even the most brazen among them knew better than to challenge her now, for this was not a moment for insubordination. It was a moment for reflection, for acknowledgement of the change that had begun and could not be undone. Then, at last, the Empress moved. It was as if the air shifted with her motion. The silence that had gripped the room snapped like a taut thread, and the gaze of every noble present turned instinctively toward her, watching for a sign. She moved with the grace of a storm cloud, drifting down from the throne, each step measured, deliberate. She did not look at the court. She did not need to. They were beneath her consideration. She focused only on Kael. There was no hesitation in her eyes as she approached. Her gaze was cold, calculating, but beneath that chill, there was something else, something Kael recognized. It was not fear, nor awe. It was the barest flicker of something far more dangerous. Interest. "You are a bold man, Kael," the Empress said, her voice breaking the stillness. It was a diagnosis, not a compliment. She spoke not with the weight of a queen, but with the authority of a ruler who had long been accustomed to controlling everything around her. Her tone was precise, sharp as a scalpel cutting into the very fabric of the court. Kael did not flinch. He had faced down gods, faced down armies, and faced down his own weaknesses with the same calm precision. "Boldness," he replied, his voice smooth, "is simply survival without apology." Her lips twitched upward, ever so slightly, a movement so subtle it might have been missed by anyone not paying close attention. Kael did not miss it. There was something in her response, something deeper, perhaps even approving. But it was fleeting, gone in an instant, replaced by the ever-present poise that had kept her on the throne for so long. "And what is it that you are surviving, Kael?" she asked, her voice softer now, probing. For a long moment, Kael did not respond. It was a dangerous question, one that could lead to revelations or entrapment. His gaze met hers, and for the first time since entering the room, he allowed himself a smile. But it was not one of arrogance, nor one of defiance. It was a smile born of something more profounder, a recognition of shared understanding, the truth that neither of them could fully express, but both knew too well. "I don't need to survive," he said finally, his words deliberate. "Not anymore. I've already won." Her eyes narrowed slightly, considering his words. She said nothing in response, but it was clear she had heard the underlying message. Kael had stepped beyond the need to struggle for survival. He was no longer fighting for a place at the table. He was positioning himself to take the entire feast. She turned to the assembled nobles, her gaze sweeping over them. The air in the room thickened with tension, as if the very walls of the chamber had become the cage of a beast that had long been dormant but was now awakening. "Enough," she commanded, her voice low and authoritative, but it held an edge sharp, like a blade held at the throat. It was a word that cut through the rising tide of discontent. A single word that silenced the opposition before it could take root. The nobles, who had murmured in rising outrage, now fell into a stunned silence. Kael remained still, his posture unyielding, as the Empress continued to speak, her voice carrying through the chamber with the force of a decree. "I have made my decision," she said, her words measured, each one falling like a hammer. "I recognize Kael's presence in this court, and his influence." The room erupted not in approval, but in chaos. The nobles, their voices rising in protests, immediately began to question her. The old alliances, the bloodlines, the foundations of the court had been shaken, and they did not know how to respond. "This is unprecedented," one noble shouted, rising from his seat in outrage. "He has no blood right." Another cried, his voice trembling with anger. "We cannot allow these," a third stammered, his words straining with fear. But the Empress did not turn to address them. She did not need to. The weight of her gaze, the force of her presence, silenced the room in a heartbeat. One look, and the nobles understood that there would be no further argument. "I trust you will not disappoint me," the Empress said to Kael, her voice lowering to a level that only he could hear. It was not a request. It was an expectation, a command wrapped in veiled threat. Kael's smile was small, but it spoke volumes. There was no uncertainty in him, no hesitation. "I don't deal in disappointment, Your Majesty," he said, his tone laced with meaning. It was both a promise and a threat. He would not fail her. He would not fail anyone. The court had already shifted. The Empress had made her move, but so had Kael. The throne remained hers. But the court was already his. And as the last murmurs of dissent faded, Kael knew that this was only the beginning. The empire that had once been hers would soon belong to him, piece by piece. The grand hall of the imperial palace shimmered in decadent gold, as though every inch of the space had been designed to remind its visitors of the power that pulsed through the empire. Light from towering crystal chandeliers cascaded down in waves of pale fire, illuminating the vast expanse of polished obsidian floors and the marble columns that stood like silent sentinels to the empire's history. The banners hanging from each pillar were ornate, their silk threads bearing the sigils of victories from countless conquests. Yet, beneath the outward splendor, there was something palpable in the air tonight, an undercurrent of tension, thick and alive, just waiting to snap. The court was filled with nobles, their presence as much a symbol of wealth as it was of trepidation. They lined the perimeter of the hall, as still as statues, some caught in whispered conversations, others lost in the weight of their own thoughts. All of them were acutely aware that tonight, something monumental was about to happen. For tonight, the storm had a name. Clardon. He entered not like a humble guest, but as a king returning to a throne long denied. His presence was a force, impossible to ignore. Each step he took rang out in the silence of the hall, the sound of his boots sharp against the smooth marble like the heralding of thunder on a quiet morning. His black coat, adorned with silver trim, flowed behind him like a banner of war. His silver hair shimmered beneath the torchlight, casting reflections that danced like flames on the polished surfaces of the hall. His eyes, crimson and piercing, swept over the assembled nobles, each one caught in his gaze for a moment before quickly looking away. His eyes were those of a predator, analytical and calculating. He was not among equals here. He was among prey. Beside him, Empress Eleanor walked with regal grace, a flame in human form. Her crimson gown clung to her body like velvet, emphasizing every curve of her figure. But there was more than beauty in her presence tonight. There was power. Her once dutiful eyes, those of a queen by duty alone, had shifted in the past days. Now, they were the eyes of a queen who had chosen her king. Her gaze never strayed from Kael's, as though she knew the fate of the emperor and perhaps her own lay in the hands of the man at her side. Behind them, Kael's agents moved like shadows, invisible to all but the most observant. Loyal nobles, cloaked agents, and silent eyes hidden in the rafters. They were everywhere, watching, waiting for the signal to act. Tonight, the game would be played on Kael's terms. At the far end of the hall, Emperor Castiel Valerius sat upon his throne, his figure a shadow of the man he once was. His regal posture was stiff, but beneath the weight of the crown, there was a subtle sag, as though the throne he had claimed for so long had begun to feel unbearably heavy. His hands rested on the lion heads of his throne, but his fingers tapped nervously against the gilded armrests. Once, he had been a warlord, an unchallenged force of nature. Now, he sat like a man on the verge of collapse, watching as Clouden strode into his domain with a confidence that spoke of a man who already saw the throne as his own. "Clouden," the Emperor's voice rang out, clear and measured, yet there was a hidden steel beneath it. "Your name carries far these days." Kael bowed his head just slightly, acknowledging the Emperor's words, but there was no hint of submission in the gesture. "Your Majesty honors me," he replied, his voice smooth, composed, a voice that had been forged in the crucible of countless political battles. The tension in the hall was palpable. Even the most stoic of the nobles seemed to hold their breath, caught between the two men who represented the past and the future of the empire. "You've bent the northern territories to your will," the Emperor continued, his gaze narrowing ever so slightly. "You've made allies of houses that have long been considered enemies of the throne. One might say you've constructed your own empire within mine." Kael's lips curved faintly, his eyes cold as ice. "A stable realm is a stronger realm. I serve that cause." The nobles shifted uneasily, sensing the quiet power that radiated from Kael. He wasn't just claiming loyalty. He was claiming relevance, power, necessary presence. The unspoken message was clear: he was indispensable, and he knew it. A sardonic chuckle broke through the tension as Grand Duke Marsla, old, sharp, and brittle as broken glass, leaned forward in his seat. "Some might say you are becoming equal to the throne itself." Kael's gaze met the Duke's, his silence a weapon in itself. There was no pride in his eyes, no arrogancy, only quiet dominance. "Only a fool rivals the empire. A wiser man becomes indispensable to it." The words were soft as silk, but they were edged with the weight of 1,000 truths. The court understood. So did the Emperor. But before the tension could snap into something more dangerous, a shrill scream cut through the air. "Assassins!" In the eastern corridor, Lady Valeria has been attacked. The room erupted into chaos. Guards surged forward, swords drawn, panic spreading like wildfire. The noble court, once still as statues, became a whirlwind of movement, their voices a dissonant chorus of confusion and alarm. Someone shouted for the Imperial Guard, but it was already too late. Kael's eyes flashed. Without a word, he turned to Eleanor, his voice low but commanding. "Stay with me." And then, in a blur of motion, he was gone. The hall had erupted, but Kael was a predator in its midst, moving with lethal precision. His movements were as fluid as a shadow, his boots barely making a sound as they struck the marble. He reached the eastern corridor ahead of the Imperial Guard, the cold air of the palace seemingly unable to touch him. As he moved through it, what greeted him in the corridor was carnage. Kael's personal agents, his shadows, were engaged in brutal combat with masked assassins. The assassins wore midnight black armor, the glint of their blades dancing in the dim light. Blood splattered the walls in jagged arcs, painting the stone a sickening shade of red. Lady Valeria, a noble loyal to Kael, was down on the floor, clutching her side as blood pooled beneath her. Kael's face remained expressionless, his crimson eyes cold as he surveyed the battlefield. He did not hesitate. He did not waste time. His sword was in his hand, and the killing blow was already in motion. In one smooth motion, Kael dispatched an assassin. His blade flashed, and the man's throat parted like silk. The body crumpled to the floor with an almost graceful finality. Another assassin lunged at him, but Kael anticipated the strike. His hand was already there, twisting the wrist with the precision of a master. The assassin's blade clattered to the floor as Kael drove his dagger up through the man's ribs, the point of the blade emerging from between his shoulder blades in one clean motion. Blood splattered, but Kael did not flinch. There was no hesitation, no remorse. There was only the cold, clinical execution of a threat. A third assassino, a woman, hesitated. Her blade trembled in her hands, her resolve faltering as she locked eyes with Kael. He could see the fear in her gaze, but there was no mercy in his. He moved swiftly, his dagger plunging into her chest with a single, decisive thrust. Her body crumpled to the floor, her hand outstretched in a futile grasp at life. The final assassin, desperate and out of his depth, turned to flee. Kael moved with the grace of a storm. He threw his dagger with the precision of a practiced hand, and the weapon embedded itself between the assassin's shoulder blades, sending him crashing to the floor in an untidy heap. The corridor fell silent. The Imperial Guard arrived moments later, their faces pale as they surveyed the carnage. They looked at Kael, standing alone amidst the bodies, blood dripping from his hands, and they understood. Klarden was not to be trifled with. But the Emperor arrived last, his regal steps slow and measured as he approached the scene of slaughter. His guards surrounded him, their faces drawn tight with fear as they took in the sight of the dead assassins and the blood that stained the floor. Kael stood amidst the chaos, calm and unsullied, like a god of death. He did not flinch, he did not speak. And then, in the stillness, his eyes locked with the Emperor's. Kael bent down, picking up a sigil that had fallen from one of the assassins. It was the mark of Duke Reinhardt's faction, an old, loyalist house that had long been tied by blood to Castile himself. The silence in the corridor grew even more oppressive. Kael held the sigil out to the Emperor, not with accusation, but as a simple demonstration of a fact. He said nothing, but his actions spoke volumes. "It appears, Your Majesty," Kael said softly, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable truth, "that your enemies are no longer content to hide." The Emperor said nothing, but his eyes hardened. He saw it now, what had been made clear by Kael's brutal efficiency. His enemies, the ones that had lurked in the shadows, had come out into the light. And Kael was the one who had exposed them. Kael dropped the sigil onto the floor, the sound of metal striking stone echoing through the empty hall like a verdict. "And that," Kael continued with a faint smile, "is a problem we must resolve." He bowed slightly, and not as a servant, but as a partner, a king in waiting. And the Emperor, silent and defeated, understood. The balance had shifted. Kael had not only survived the night, he had rewritten it. The throne room of the Imperial Palace have not seen such a moment in decades. The once magnificent hall, adorned with gold and marble, had become a place of uneasy tension, as if the very walls could feel the shifting tides of power. The air was thick with the residue of violence, the scent of blood still lingering despite the attempts of the servants to cleanse it away. The remnants of the earlier assassination attempt on Lady Valeria hung in the silence, a bitter reminder that the Empire had begun to crack at its very foundation. Nobles are once haughty, proud, and filled with the intoxicating certainty of their own importance, here now stood huddled in groups, whispers flickering between them like shadowy flames. Their eyes darted between Emperor Castile, seated upon his mighty throne, and the man who now stood as a figure of undeniable dominance in the Empire, Klarden. At the far end of the room, Emperor Castile Valerius sat tall, his posture stiff with the weight of his years, the weight of his crown, and now the undeniable weight of the circumstances that threatened to unravel him. His hands, once firm and decisive, now rested lightly on the lion heads of his throne, fingers tapping in agitation, a nervous habit that betrayed the facade of imperial control. His once piercing eyes, filled with the confidence of a ruler whose will bent nations, now betrayed a flicker of doubt, caught between the knowledge that his time was rapidly running out and the realization that the game had changed forever. Klarden, standing at the center of the room like a shadow that could swallow the light itself, exuded an aura that made the very air feel heavier. His black coat, trimmed with silver, flowed behind him like a banner, an unmistakable symbol of his rise, a subtle declaration that his dominance was no longer a mere possibility. His silver hair caught the flicker of torchlight, gleaming with a cold brilliance that made him appear almost ethereal, like a creature that did not belong in a room filled with men and women who thought themselves in control. His crimson eyes are the eyes of a man who saw through everything, who read intentions and plotted destinies in the same breath as swept the room with quiet power. His gaze locked onto each noble, each individual in the room. One by one they shrank under it, afraid to meet his eyes for too long, for in those depths lay something more dangerous than the swords they carried, the ability to tear apart their lives with nothing more than a word. The Emperor's voice, low and filled with cold authority, broke the silence. The insignia was Reinhardt's, one of my oldest and the most trusted allies. His voice was edged with anger, but also with a tinge of resignation. And yet, an assassin bearing that very symbol struck within my own palace, on my very doorstep. Kael's reply was as smooth as velvet, yet as sharp as a blade. One could say, Your Majesty, that this attack strikes not just at your palace, but at your rule itself. His words hung in the air like a challenge, a reminder that the Emperor's hold on his throne was no longer as unshakable as it once seemed. If you allow such an insult to pass without response, the nobles will see only weakness, and weakness is something no ruler can afford. There was a pause, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The Emperor's fingers tightened around the armrests of his throne, his knuckles going white as his mind weighed the gravity of Kael's words. The air was thick with the unspoken understanding between them. This was not merely an accusation, it was a calculated move in the game of power. And Kael had just declared himself the dominant player. Castiel's eyes, sharp and calculating, bore into Kael's with a silent challenge, as though trying to decipher the man standing before him. And what would Duke Arden advise, then? Execution. Would you have me strike down one of my own with nothing more than suspicion to guide my hand? Kael's lips curved into a faint smile, one that never reached his eyes. It was the smile of a man who knew he had already won. Not yet, Your Majesty. A public trial, I propose. Let Duke Reinhardt face his accusers in the full light of the court. If he is innocent, then justice is served. If not. A broken bar, his voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the room. Then you have the opportunity to root out the treason that festers within your very walls. The logic was irrefutable, but suffocating. A trial would allow the Emperor to present himself as a ruler of justice, a man above suspicion. But it also placed Reinhardt in the center of the Empire's attention, exposing him to Kael's machinations. Either way, Castiel would lose. The only question was how much. There was an almost imperceptible shift in the room, as though the nobles themselves could feel the weight of Kael's words settling over them like a storm cloud. The air was taut with anticipation. I support Duke Arden's proposal, came a voice clear, cold, and unwavering. The Empress Eleanor, her figure draped in a gown of deep crimson that seemed to glow in the torchlight, stepped forward. Her golden eyes, once soft with the adoration of a loyal wife, now held the intensity of a woman who had found a new path, one in which Clarden stood as her true king. She turned toward her husband, her gaze unflinching. A crown that permits chaos invites doubt. If we do not respond decisively, the people will see not the strength of the Empire, but its fragility. The chamber seemed to hold its breath. This was no longer a matter of politics or strategy. This was personal. The Empress was no longer merely a consort to the Emperor. She was an active player, a force unto herself, and she had chosen her side. Kael did not look at her, but her presence was undeniable. She was standing beside him now, not as a mere bystander, but as a partner in a game far greater than even the Emperor had anticipated. The nobles shifted uneasily, some of them exchanging glances, as if trying to make sense of the new order that was taking shape before their eyes. Castiel's lips tightened into a thin line. His eyes flicked between his wife and the man who had just, in the space of a few short moments, made it clear that he now held the power to control the future of the Empire. Very well, the Emperor said at last, his voice low and reluctant. Duke Reinhardt will stand trial 1 week from now. Kael inclined his head, his expression calm, composed. Your wisdom continues to uphold the Empire, Your Majesty. A thin smile curled at the corners of the Emperor's mouth, but it was a smile laced with bitterness. He knew he had no other choice. The decision had been made. The storm that Kael had stirred would now break, and he would have to weather it no matter the cost. The murmurs began again, softer this time, but no less dangerous. The nobility, ever opportunistic, whispered among themselves, exchanging rumors and speculations about what this trial would mean for the future of the empire. Some saw it as a power struggle between the emperor and Clayton. Others saw it as the beginning of a new era, one in which the emperor's grip on power would slip, ever so slightly, until it was no longer his to hold. As the nobles filed out of the throne room, their faces masked with veils of civility, one figure remained behind. Grand Duke Marcel, Castile's most trusted advisor, moved slowly toward Kael, his thin smile barely visible beneath his grey beard. "A bold decision," he said, his voice laced with a quiet, knowing mockery. "Let us hope it does not open doors better left closed." Kael met his gaze with quiet dominance. "Only the guilty fear open doors, Grand Duke," he replied softly, the words laced with a promise of retribution. Marcel's smile faltered, but he said nothing more. The game was in motion, and neither of them could predict exactly where it would lead. That night, in the solitude of his quarters, Kael sat alone at his desk, a goblet of dark wine in his hand. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across his sharp features, and for a moment, the man who had become the puppet master of the empire allowed himself a rare moment of contemplation. Across from him, Valeria, her arm bandaged and her eyes filled with a storm of emotions, sat in silence. She had been in the thick of the earlier battle, wounded but alive. She had fought for him, as she always had, but even she was beginning to understand the full scope of his plans. "You could have forced Reinhardt's guilt in front of them all," she said, her voice tinged with both admiration and concern. "You didn't need this circus. You could have crushed him before he even had a chance to defend himself." Kael set his goblet down, his expression calm, but his eyes held a glint of cold brilliance. "Reinhardt isn't the real enemy, Valeria," he said, his voice soft but filled with purpose. "He's a pawn, nothing more. The true enemy is the one who hides behind him, the one who orchestrated this attack from the shadows." Valeria raised an eyebrow. "So, this trial is a lesson for them? A demonstration?" Kael's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "A demonstration, yes. But it's also a reminder that in the game of power, no one is untouchable. Not even the emperor." He rose from his seat and moved toward the balcony, looking out over the city that lay sprawled beneath him, its lights twinkling like a sea of stars. The night was still, but beneath its surface, a storm was brewing. "1 week," Kael murmured, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. "1 week for the empire to watch, to fear, to choose. 1 week for the emperor to realize that this trial isn't about justice." He turned, his eyes gleaming with the fire of ambition. "It's about who truly rules the empire." The imperial palace pulsed with a low, nervous energy, the very walls of its marble corridors seeming to hum with the weight of secrets and the stirrings of ambition. Whispers, like ghosts, curled around every corner, reaching into the most hidden corners of the court. Word had spread like wildfire, and the upcoming trial of Duke Reinhardt had not just shaken the foundation of the empire's politics, it had cracked it open entirely, spilling blood, desires, and fears into the public eye. In his chamber, cloaked in shadows and the light of flickering candles, Kael sat motionless, his eyes dark pools of quiet calculation. His mind raced through the labyrinth of schemes and lies that had already begun to unfurl with the trial of Reinhardt, to an event he had engineered with the same care he might employ when setting a trap for a mouse. But this was no simple rat, and this trap was no ordinary snare. Serafina entered the room as if woven from shadow herself, her cloak fluttering soundlessly behind her. She was a creature of secrecy, both in form and purpose. She had become one of Kael's most trusted instruments in the court, an ally capable of gleaning the smallest threads of information and pulling them taut until they unraveled before him. "The Grand Duke," Serafina began, her voice a low murmur, "has been meeting with nobles ones who claim neutrality, but their movements are far from it. Midnight gatherings, whispers of sabotage. Some want Reinhardt's swift execution to wipe away the stench of his perceived guilt, while others wish for a forced verdict that will serve only to discredit you and weaken your position." Kael's fingers drummed idly against the polished surface of the desk before him. His expression was unreadable, but his mind whirred behind the calm veneer. "Predictable," he murmured, his lips curving into the faintest of smiles. Serafina raised a single eyebrow, her sharp gaze studying him for a moment before she spoke again. "You don't seem concerned." Kael's smile deepened, a hint of cold amusement flashing in his eyes. "Because concern," he said, his voice measured, "is for those who react. I anticipate." Seraphina regarded him silently for a long moment before speaking again, her tone more probing this time. "They fear you." "Good." He let the word linger in the air, a simple, chilling declaration. "Fear is a leash." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "But leashes become garrots when held too tightly. This court is full of men with sharp hands. Let them pull." Kael replied softly, the gleam of his eyes darker still. "The tighter they grip, the more they bleed." Elsewhere, in another wing of the palace, Emperor Castiel Valerius sat brooding in the gloom of his private chambers. The only light in the room came from a pair of flickering candles that threw tall shadows against the walls. His face was etched with the lines of worry, his eyes sunken from the weight of decisions he had no choice but to face. Grand Duke Marcel stood across from him, his expression a hard mask of concern. "This trial empowers him." Marcel's voice was edged with warning. "It makes Kael look like the voice of law and reason, and you hesitate." Castiel's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist. "You think I don't see that?" "If you see it," Marcel pressed, his voice lower, more insistent, "then act. Arrest him. Discredit him. Break him before the nobles start to whisper about succession. Let them fear you again, or they will choose him instead." The Emperor's gaze sharpened, and he met Marcel's words with a cold resolve. "If I do that, I make him a martyr." A symbol. Marcel's icy gaze flickered, and he took a step closer. "Then you must make him bleed quietly. Remind Hema and the court who the crown still rests upon." As the conversation unfolded in the Emperor's chamber, Kael was already several steps ahead, his mind working with quiet precision. The next morning brought with it the arrival of a sealed letter. A letter that carried no insignia of the emperor, but bore the delicate, intricate crest of the empress, a sunflower symbol that bespoke a power all its own. Seraphina watched him as he broke the seal, her eyes narrowing in curiosity. "She summons you," she said softly. "Alone." Her private chambers. Kael's fingers briefly lingered on the parchment, his gaze calculating, before he looked up at her. There was no alarm in his eyes, only a cold curiosity. "Interesting," he murmured, his voice low and almost amused. "Prepare my attire." "And if it's a trap?" Seraphina asked, her tone wary. Kael's smirk spread just a little wider, and he stood, brushing past her to collect his cloak from the chair. "Then we'll see who walks away bleeding." Empress Eleanor's private quarters were worlds apart from the cold, opulent grandeur of the palace. The scent of honeysuckle drifted in from the open windows, and the light from the morning sun played on the silken drapes, making the room feel almost ethereal. She stood at the edge of the balcony, her back to him as her golden hair shimmered in the sun's embrace, and her dress flowed in gentle waves, as though she were one with the wind itself. "You've stirred the court like a storm, Duke Arden," Eleanor's voice rang out, sharp and rich with a sense of authority that had not been granted to her by birth alone. "The nobles whisper your name more than they do the emperor's." Kael made no move, simply allowing the moment to stretch between them like a tightrope. He would not be the one to break the silence. She turned then, her golden eyes flashing with an intensity that matched his own. "Tell me, Kael, what is it that you truly want?" He did not flinch, did not waver. His response was simple, direct, and almost too honest. "Everything." Her lips curled into a smile, though it was not one of mockery or amusement. No, this smile held something deeper, a recognition of something she, too, could not ignore. "Ambitious," she said softly, her voice as cultured and dangerous as a blade. Kael stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Number." "Inevitable." The Empress's laughter was low, cultured, and dangerous. It filled the room like a faint echo, a reminder that there was far more at play than either of them could afford to ignore. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice a whisper in the space between them, "we seek the same storm." He studied her closely, his gaze unwavering. "Do we?" Eleanor moved toward him with the grace of a serpent, her steps so calculated, so deliberate that they seemed to glide. The empire's gaze My husband sees ghosts in every shadow. He clings to traditions like a dying priest clings to scripture. He fears you." Her eyes softened, though the hardness behind them remained. "I do not." That declaration hung between them, sharp and cutting. It was not merely an admission, it was a challenge, a statement of intent. "You seek a future built on strength," she continued, her voice becoming softer but no less resolute. "I seek one ruled by vision and not fear." Kael tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "And where do you see yourself in that future?" Her answer came swiftly, without hesitation, a vision that had been forming in her mind long before Kael had ever arrived at her doorstep. At the top, a laugh, low and dark, escaped Kael's lips. "And the Emperor?" he asked, the question hanging between them, laden with more meaning than it would have held for any other. Eleanor walked past him, the faintest brush of her silk gown against his arm sending a charge of tension through the air. She paused just behind his shoulder, her voice a murmur that sent a shiver down his spine. "Empires fall, especially those ruled by men too afraid to make enemies." He turned fully now, their proximity intimate and electric, a pull between them that neither could deny. He leaned in, just slightly, his voice low and dangerous. "Then tell me, Empress, how do we begin?" Eleanor's golden eyes glittered with something far darker now, a something born of ambition, of power, of a hunger that matched his own. She smiled, a smile of sharp edges and infinite promises. "We start with fire." The candlelight in Empress Eleanor Valerius's private chamber flickered and danced, casting fractured golden strokes across the lavish silken drapes that lined the walls. The air was thick with exotic incense, swirling like the intentions hanging heavy in the room, unspoken but palpable. A slow, dangerous silence enveloped the space, and in its heart stood Clardner, still, composed, and utterly unreadable. Before him stood Empress Eleanor, regal and poised, not as the untouchable jewel of the empire, but as a woman with ambitions far darker and more dangerous than mere survival. Her golden eyes shimmered not with the innocence of a queen, but with something far more lethal, a hunger for power, and perhaps, an understanding of exactly what it would take to claim it. Kael's sharp gaze lingered on her, assessing, calculating. His crimson eyes, often cold and dispassionate, betrayed nothing of the thoughts swirling beneath his composed exterior. With a slight arch of his brow, he broke the heavy silence. "You are asking me to betray the Emperor," he said, his voice low, a touch of amusement running beneath the words. Eleanor did not flinch. Her lips, painted the color of fresh wine, curled upward into a faint, dangerous smile. She took a single step forward, closing the distance between them like a predator stalking its prey. Her steps were deliberate, slower, each one purposeful, as though her very presence was a weapon. The room felt smaller, constricting, as if the space between them was growing tighter, more suffocating. "No," she answered, her voice smooth, measured, dripping with honeyed poison. "I am not asking you to betray the Emperor. I am asking you to help me build something far stronger." Kael's crimson eyes gleamed, the faintest trace of amusement dancing across his features. "An empire where you rule?" he questioned, the words soft but heavy with implication. She smiled, no mockery, no coyness, but the confidence of a woman who had seen the world for what it was and had learned to shape it with her will. "An empire where we rule." Her words were like honey laced with poison. They slid over him, soft but cutting, filled with the promise of power and ruin. The weight of them hung in the air between them, an unspoken challenge, an invitation to step beyond the boundaries of the empire's fragile facade. Kael allowed the silence to stretch, neither yielding nor revealing his thoughts. He didn't need to speak immediately. He was a man who understood the power of patience, of holding the upper hand through the simple act of waiting. When he finally spoke, his voice was like steel sliding free of silk, cold, calculated, and unyielding. "And what makes you believe I would accept?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly, though the rest of him remained still. Eleanor did not flinch. Instead, she took another step forward, her presence growing more insistent, more magnetic. She stood so close now that Kael could feel the heat radiating off her, the weight of her ambition pressing against him like the sun itself. "Because, Kael," she whispered, her voice low and dangerous, "you are not a man who kneels. You are a man who conquers." And a broken bar. She paused, letting the words hang in the air like a trap about to spring. A broken bar. I offer you a throne that begs to be taken. Kael's lips curved into a soft, knowing smile, one that was as dark as it was amused. He brushed a gloved hand against the back of a velvet chair but made no move to sit, his posture still one of dominance, of control. You assume I want the throne, he said, his tone mocking, but with an edge of sharpness beneath it. Eleanor's eyes never left his. No, she corrected him, her voice calm but insistent. I assume you want control, and I know the difference. Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. She knew him. She understood the true nature of power, and she understood what Kael truly desired: a control, not the fragile seat of a ruler, but the threads that held the world together. Elsewhere in the imperial palace, beneath the looming shadows of stained glass halls, Emperor Castiel Valerius sat alone in his study. The low, flickering light of candles barely illuminated the room, and the faint smell of old parchment and ink lingered in the air. His fingers gripped a wineglass so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Across from him, Grand Duke Marcel stood at attention, his face a mask of cold concern. She met with him, Marcel said, his voice low, tight with barely contained worry. Privately. No attendants, no guards. Castiel's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face clenching with barely suppressed anger. And you do not know what passed between them? His voice was tight with frustration, a dangerous edge creeping into it. No, Marcel replied, his frown deepening. But we both know what Eleanor is capable of. And what Arden desires, Castiel added, his eyes darkening with suspicion. His gaze shifted to the window, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. I want the Inquisitors mobilized. Quietly. No public stain. Marcel hesitated, concern flickering in his eyes. If we move too sooner. If I do not act now, Castiel interrupted, his voice a chilling whisper, there may be no throne left to defend. Back in Eleanor's private chamber, Kael slowly lifted his goblet, tracing its rim with the edge of his thumb. The wine swirled inside, dark and rich, much like the thoughts that now churned in his mind. He met Eleanor's eyes over the rim of his cup, amusement flickering in the depths of his crimson gaze. You want to dethrone your husband, he said softly, each word deliberate and laced with measured precision. And you believe I am the blade? Eleanor's approach was slow and graceful, like a queen navigating her kingdom. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in her movements. She closed the final gap between them, and as she did, the air seemed to grow heavier, more charged. She was the predator, and Kael knew he was in her sights. Yet, for all her grace, for all the beauty and power that radiated from her, she could not escape the cold calculation in Kael's eyes. You're not the blade, she murmured, her voice dropping to a whisper as she stepped close enough for him to feel her breath. You're the hand that wields it. The throne bends to those who dare seize it. Kael tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. And your plan? Her lips brushed the edge of his jaw in a not a kiss, but something far more intimate, far more claiming. The nobles are fractured. The generals crave strength. The people hunger for a symbol. You, Kael, are that symbol. Kael's laugh was soft, low, and rich with dark amusement. It was the sound of a man who had already won, who already understood the game being played. You want me to fracture the throne so you can rise beside me? Her voice was a low whisper, the words dripping like poison from her lips. I want an empire that does not beg for survival. I want power forged, not inherited. I want to build it with someone who cannot be controlled. For the briefest moment, Kael's gaze sharpened, his features hardening. There was something in her eyes that made him pause, a flicker of something deeper than mere ambition. He studied her for a long moment, weighing her words, his mind turning as swiftly and ruthlessly as ever. And if I decide to claim it alone? He asked, his voice low and dangerous, his every word a challenge. Eleanor's smile never wavered. She met his gaze with unflinching certainty. Then let's see who survives the fire. A long silence stretched between them, thick with tension, thick with possibility. Two predators, circling one another, testing, measuring, weighing the cost of betrayal and the allure of power. Finally, Kael extended his hand, cloaked in silken strategy, the same hand that had crushed empires and manipulated hearts. Eleanor, without hesitation, placed hers into it. Her grip was firm, unyielding, and as dangerous as the promise in her words. No fear, No second thoughts. A pact forged in fire and betrayal, sealed in silence. And across the imperial palace, unseen gears began to turn. The empire would never be the same. The night pressed itself upon the imperial palace like a velvet glove, soft yet suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of impending change, laced with incense that clung to the walls, curling into the dark corners like silent whispers. The moon hung high, an unblinking eye that bathed the palace in a pale glow. Its light revealed nothing of the true struggle unfolding beneath the gilded facades of the empire. Clauden moved through the silent hallways, his steps fluid and deliberate, like the hunter aware of his prey's every movement. His mind was a whirlwind. The meeting with Empress Eleanor had shaken him more than he'd anticipated. Beneath the veneer of civility, there had been an undercurrent of ambition, something raw and untamed that both intrigued and unsettled him. She was dangerous not just because of what she could offer, but because of what she already understood about him. The Empress knew he did not kneel, and for that, she wanted to make him a partner, a kingmaker, perhaps. But he did not trust alliances. Not now, not ever. Kael had never been anyone's tool, not even hers. The streets of the city below echoed with the murmur of rebellion. The whispers had become louder, more insistent. The people were no longer just subjects. They were pawns, tools to be used, discarded, or lifted into greatness. He could feel the pulse of the rebellion in every step, every shadow that crossed his path. It was a low humor beat that reverberated through the cobblestones and into the very marrow of his bones. The city was on the edge, teetering between the suffocating grip of the Emperor and the burning fire of change. The Duke stands against the corruption. He's the only one who dares challenge the Emperor. If war breaks a broken bar, I'd follow him. Not the crown. Kael's name had become a symbol or a beacon of defiance. He had come to the capital to stake his claim on power, but he had underestimated just how deeply his influence had taken root. And now, there was no turning back. He had become something more than a man, something more than a noble with ambition. He was a harbinger of change, and change was never without sacrifice. The city, once a place of comfort and luxury, now felt like a cage, or a gilded one, perhaps, but still a cage. The rebellion had begun in whispers, in darkened corners where the light of the empire could not reach. But it was spreading like fire, its tendrils reaching deeper with each passing moment. And soon, there would be no hiding the flames. As Kael moved through the noble district, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows, he knew that species those who had once been his Alyssa were everywhere. The city was crawling with them, like vermin in the walls. But one stood out to him, and not just because of the scent of blood and ash that clung to her like a second skin. She was skilled, lethal. She had the look of someone who had lived in the shadows for far too long, a predator with no name. "You've followed me long enough," Kael said, his voice smooth and cutting as the wind itself. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the moonlight like a ghost. Velka, the Emperor's inquisitor, clad in black leather that swallowed the light, her crimson eyes gleaming with the hunger of a predator who had found its prey. She was beautiful in an unsettling way, an ethereal and lethal beauty that left no room for doubt about her capabilities. "The Emperor requests your presence," she said, her voice a soft purr, but underneath it, there was an undeniable command. Kael studied her for a moment, the faintest trace of amusement tugging at the corners of his lips. "And here I thought he'd ask nicely." Velka's lips curled into a faint smile. "A dangerous thing." "You overestimate your worth, Duke Arden." "No," Kael replied, his voice smooth, without a hint of fear. "I estimate it precisely." "That's what makes me dangerous." Her smile faltered just slightly, and for a moment, Kael saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a disbelief, perhaps. But she recovered quickly, as all inquisitors did. She gestured for him to follow, and he did, not with hesitation, but with the casual ease of someone who knew that no matter where they were going, they controlled the pace. They walked through the labyrinth of the Imperial Palace, its grandeur a cruel reminder of the Empire's decay, and entered the throne room. It was there that Kael met the Emperor, Castiel Valerius, seated high upon his throne of iron and gold. The room felt suffocating. The torches on the walls flickered, casting long shadows that twisted like the corruption at the heart of the empire. At Castiel's side, Grand Duke Marcel stood silent, his dark eyes unwavering, as ever. "The Emperor said," his voice calm, but the tension in his words was palpable. "Do you know why you're here?" Kael stepped forward, his movements measured. He was the predator in this room, not Castiel, not Marcel. "You want to know where my loyalties lie?" Castiel's fingers tapped against the armrest of his throne, his golden gaze flicking over Kael. I want to remind you where they should." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, pressing down on both men. Kael didn't speak. He let the silence stretch, giving Castiel the opportunity to reveal whatever it was that he thought might sway Kael's opinion. But Kael already knew that Castiel would never trust him. He saw Kael as a threat, as a rival to be controlled or destroyed. There was no loyalty to be gained here, only a noose to be tightened. The Emperor finally leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You've been a broken bar active. The nobles speak your name. The people whisper it like prayer. Even my Empress seems a broken bar interested." Kael's lips curled into a smile, one that held no warmth. "Perhaps she simply prefers ambition over stagnation." Castiel's posture stiffened. He rose slowly, the weight of his movement a deliberate display of power. "You are becoming a problem." Kael didn't flinch. He was used to being underestimated. "And yet, here I stand," he said, his voice a cool echo in the oppressive silence. "Because I see potential," Castiel said, his voice now colder, tinged with venom. "Serve me, Trulia, and I will elevate you beyond anything you've dreamed." Kael tilted his head, his crimson eyes narrowing. "And if I refuse?" The torches in the chamber seemed to dim as the tension in the room grew. Velka's stance shifted subtly, her fingers twitching toward the hilt of her blade. Marcel's hand brushed against the scabbard of his sword, a silent warning. Castiel's golden eyes flashed with something darker. "Then I will erase you." Kael stood still, unyielding, unbowed. "I see," he said quietly. "Then allow me to return the courtesy." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Kael turned, his cloak swirling behind him, and walked out of the throne room with the kind of confidence that made even the Emperor's glare seem impotent. The silence in the room lasted for only a moment before it was shattered by the Emperor's harsh whisper. "He will burn us all." But Kael was already gone, and the wheels of fate had already begun to turn. In the silence of his estate, Kael sat alone in his study. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warm light dancing across the dark, carved wood of the room. Maps of the Empire were spread out before him, each one a reflection of his growing control. A glass of wine sat untouched beside him. 3 paths lay before him, each one soaked in blood, power, and consequence. Ally with Eleanor. She was brilliant, ruthless, and already moving her pieces across the board. But was she trustworthy? Could her ambition be tempered, or would it turn on him? Her desire for the throne was too great, and a queen's hunger for power could rival that of any demon. Submit to Castiel. The false path. Castiel was too blind with fear to ever trust him. A man like Kael would never be a servant to someone so weak. Castiel's leash was nothing but a noose, and Kael would never wear it. Forge his own throne. Break the old order. Burn the lies and deceit. Build something new, something stronger, from the ashes of those who underestimated him. He was not a tool to be wielded, he was the force that reshaped empires. Kael leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing against him. But he also felt the surge of power, the thrill of possibility. The empire was rotting from within. Its crown tarnished, its rulers fractured. And Kael was about to become the blade that cut through the decay. The night stretched across the imperial city like a coiled serpent, silent, watching, waiting to strike. The air was thick with the promise of upheaval, thick with the potential for betrayal and violence. Each corner of the city seemed alive, thrumming with the undercurrent of tension. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting its cold gaze over the empire's labyrinthine streets. Below, the populace slept uneasy, dreaming of futures shaped by forces they did not understand. In the heart of Claudin's estate, the flickering candlelight danced over a vast table strewn with maps, sigils, and coded messages. Kael stood before it, unmoving, his dark eyes scanning the complex network of territories, military strongholds, and the scattered loyalists of the empire. To most, it was nothing more than parchment, insignificant, frail. To Kael, it was a battlefield, and every piece, every movement, was a note in a symphony of strategy. He had known this moment would come. The emperor had tried to cage him with threats, with promises of power. But Kael was not a man to be caged. He was a storm, and storms could never be contained. Castiel had underestimated him, and Kael would make sure the Emperor understood the cost of that miscalculation. His thoughts lingered on the encounter earlier that evening, the cold exchange in the Emperor's throne room. "You are dangerous," Castiel had said. "Then try," Kael had answered. It had been a challenge, an unspoken declaration. A line had been drawn, and there would be no turning back from it now. A sharp knock at the door pulled Kael from his thoughts. Without turning, he spoke, his voice smooth, controlled. "Enter." The door opened to reveal Alicia, her presence as commanding as ever. She entered the room with the grace of a predator, her silver eyes cool and calculating. The elven strategist was a creature of war, a living embodiment of centuries of battlefield experience. Yet, even she carried a flicker of unease, something Kael was quick to notice. "Someone attempted to breach the estate," Alicia reported, her voice unwavering. "They were intercepted." Kael did not flinch. "Dead?" Alicia's lips curled ever so slightly, a rare hint of amusement playing at the edges of her expression. "I handled it personally." Kael gave a single nod, acknowledging her efficiency. His eyes, however, never left the black envelope she placed before him. There was no insignia, no royal seal, only a thin coating of black wax, an unmistakable sign of secrecy. Whoever sent it had ensured that it would be impossible to trace back to them. He broke the seal, unfolding the parchment within. The elegant script, written in blood-red ink, read, "The caged bird sings at dawn. Will you listen?" Kael's gaze hardened, his mind already unraveling the meaning beneath the surface. It was poetry, a beautiful, cryptic. But this was no lover's verse. No, this was a message, one laced with hidden intent. A warning, or an invitation. "Whoever sent this," Kael said, his voice low and deliberate, "already believes I can be swayed. That makes them either bolder or desperate." Alicia raised an eyebrow, her voice cool. "And if they're right?" Kael stepped away from the table, his cloak swirling behind him like an extension of his own thoughts. His eyes were cold, harder, focused on the path ahead. "Then we test their nerve." The next few hours passed in calculated silence. Kael, disguised in the simple cloak of a commoner, walked the winding slums beneath the noble district. The air was thick with the stench of rot, incense, and rebellion. But in this world of decay, Kael moved like a shadow, unnoticed, unseen. In the underbelly of the Empire, power was as fragile as glass, and every step he took carried the weight of revolution. The message had been clear. The meeting place was an abandoned temple at the edge of the district. Once a place of worship to a god now forgotten, it had fallen into ruin, overtaken by ivy and time. Yet, for all its decay, it held significance to those who needed it most, to those who whispered in the dark corners of the Empire. As Kael stepped through the ancient, heavy doors, the smell of dust and age filled his nostrils. Moonlight poured through shattered windows, illuminating the crumbling altar where a lone figure stood waiting. She stepped forward from the shadows, her cloak crimson against the pale light. Her golden hair tumbled over her shoulders like liquid sunlight, but her expression was a mask, hard, resolute. Beneath the hood, there were no signs of fear, only purpose. Princess Seraphina Valerius, daughter of Emperor Castiel, heiress to a crumbling empire. And now, a traitor. Kael did not flinch at the sight of her. Instead, he took a step forward, his voice cutting the silence like a blade. "So, you sing." Seraphina did not flinch. Her emerald eyes were unwavering, filled with a quiet intensity. "And you listened?" There was no hesitation in her words. She was not here to beg. She was here to make a statement. Kael studied her, his gaze unwavering. "Do you realize what this meeting means?" "If your father finds out, I will be executed by morning," she interrupted, her voice calm, even. "Yes, I know." She stepped closer, her voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the air between them. "That's why I didn't send a messenger. I came myself." Kael regarded her for a long moment, noting the absence of any tremor in her stance. She was not afraid. She had nothing left to lose. "Then speak," he commanded, his tone flat, unreadable. "Why risk everything?" Seraphina's expression hardened, and for a moment, her voice cracked like a whip. "Because the empire is rotting. My father rules through fear and silence. The nobles bleed the people dry while Castiel plays God. You know this. You've seen it." Kael's lips curled slightly, though his eyes remained cold. "What do you want?" Seraphina's eyes flared with unspoken passion, and her words spilled out, unbroken. "To end him." Kael's gaze never wavered. The words hung between them like a guillotine's blade, sharp and final. There was no negotiation here, only the cold reality of power. He took a step forward, closing the space between them. "And what could a bird offer to the storm?" Seraphina's eyes blazed with conviction. "The Eastern Division of the Imperial Army. They follow me, not my father. If you move against him, they will stand with you." The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with the weight of the offer. An entire division, loyal to her. To him, it was a coup, a betrayal of her own bloodline. Kael studied her, his mind working through the possibilities. But there was no sign of doubt in her eyes. This was no trick. She had something real, something that could shake the Empire to its foundations. "If this is a trip, a broken bar," Kael began, his voice a low threat. "Then you're already dead," she replied, unflinching. "But you know it's not. You feel it just as I do. This empire needs to burn." Her words struck like thunder, and Kael allowed them to resonate in the silence. He had known it all along. The empire was sick. Corruption ran so deep that it had become part of its very bones. Castiel's reign was a farce, a hollow thing held up by fear. It could not last. Kael smiled, not with mockery, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who knew the storm was coming. Back at his estate, Kael poured a glass of wine but did not drink. The liquid swirled lazily in the glass, reflecting the firelight from the hearth. He stood before the flames, his face illuminated in flickers of red and orange. His mind raced with the possibilities, the consequences. Alicia entered the room without a sound. Her presence was as unassuming as ever, but Kael could see the questions in her eyes before she even spoke. "You're back early," she said, folding her arms across her chest. Kael didn't turn. The caged bird had claws. "She made her offer?" Kael nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. "A division of the Imperial Army, and the daughter of the Emperor himself." Alicia considered this in silence, her gaze distant. "Can she be trusted?" Kael finally turned to face her. But that's what makes her useful." He crossed to the map that sprawled across the table once more. The Empire stretched before him, a land of shifting allegiances, broken loyalties, and impossible choices. The lines on the map seemed to pulse, to shift as he looked at them. "Allies," Kael murmured, his voice distant. "Enemies, lovers, spies." His fingers hovered over the map before selecting a single black pawn, a symbol of both danger and opportunity. With deliberate slowness, he moved it into the heart of the Empire. His lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. "Now," he whispered, "the Emperor bleeds." The Imperial Palace loomed like a monolith against the blood-red sky, its obsidian spires clawing into the clouds and unmoving, unbending, eternal. The ancient stone, imbued with the power of generations, seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. The palace's very foundation whispered of centuries of rule, of power that had been forged in blood, steel, and treachery. Inside its shadowed halls, beneath the celestial murals depicting dead emperors, Castiel sat on his throne, a king without equals, a god among men. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the flickering light of distant torches casting long shadows across the cold marble floors. Castiel's fingers tapped a rhythm of impatience on the armrest of his throne as he gazed out over the vast war map laid before him. His empire stretched like a beast at his feet. The palace's war room was a space of cold intellect, designed for the calculation of the next move in an endless game of power. Before him, kneeling low and shrouded in shadows, was a figure draped in the black cloth of the silent blade, a shadow among shadows. Her breath was shallow, her presence a mere whisper in the vastness of the room. "Speak," Castiel commanded, his voice smooth as polished steel, devoid of emotion yet carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. The assassin bowed even lower, the clinking of her weapons a faint echo in the silence. "The princess, a broken bar, she has made contact." A pregnant pause hung in the air, tension thick enough to choke the very breath from the room. Castiel's lips parted in a slow, measured smile, a smile without warmth, a smile that could freeze the blood in one's veins. "With whom?" he asked, the words a blade sheathed in velvet. The assassin's voice trembled slightly, the only sign of her unease. "Claden, Your Majesty." Silence fell, a suffocating weight that pressed down on every soul present. The Emperor's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. His eyes narrowed to slits, and the room seemed to darken with his thoughts. The silence stretched on until the Emperor's low laughter broke through. It was quiet at first, a rumble from deep within, before it erupted in a guttural, almost predatory sound. It was the laughter of a man who had tasted victory so often that he had forgotten how to savor it. "Aha, broken bar Seraphina," the Emperor mused, his voice like black velvet laced with venom. "Finally, she bleeds her loyalty." The assembled warlords flinched. They knew better than to question his reaction. Kael was not a man who punished betrayal with rage. He did not burn with fiery passion or give in to the madness of vengeance. No, Kael punished betrayal with cold, surgical precision, and Seraphina's treachery would not be an exception. "She plays the rebel," he continued, his gaze flickering toward the war map. His fingers grazed the edges of the parchment, where flames flickered across its carved mountains and blood-red borders. "And the ever-patient spider, spins his web." "Let them plot." His voice dropped to a whisper, the words heavy with intent. "When he strikes, he will do so believing he has the upper hand." A faint, predatory smile tugged at the corners of Kael's lips. "And in that moment a broken bar," he whispered, his words slow and deliberate, "we close the noose." In the east wing of Kael's estate, darkness pooled like ink around the war table. The room, dimly lit by flickering candles, felt like a place where the threads of fate themselves were woven and unraveled. The maps were scattered, each marked with red lines of conquest, subjugation, and revolt. The flickering light of the candles cast long shadows that danced across the table like spirits of old kings, each with a tale to tell, a kingdom to fall. Ilesia stood in silence, her silver eyes locked on the figure sitting before her, Princess Seraphina Valerius. Her presence was imposing, despite the weight of fatigue that clung to her. Her golden hair, once perfectly styled, was now tousled from the journey. Dust from the slums still clung to her armor, the once pristine surface now marred with the ash of rebellion. The princess had crossed the Empire's heart, venturing through the underworld of the slums, past the hovels of the destitute and the whispered rumors of revolution. She had come alone, walking the treacherous path from the palace to Kael's estate, a bold move that spoke of determination or desperation. Her voice, when she spoke, was like the steady pulse of a drum. "Will you stand with me?" Kael leaned back in his chair, fingers toying with a slender dagger that lay across the table. The blade gleamed faintly in the candlelight, a reflection of the sharpness of his mind. His eyes were unreadable, a mask of cold calculation. His fingers traced the edges of the dagger, the soft scrape of steel against stone, the only sound breaking the silence. "Why would I?" Kael's voice was soft, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a challenge. Seraphina didn't blink. She had faced worse than this before. "Because the throne is within reach, and I'm offering it to you." Kael's lips twitched in the smallest of smiles, though it was far from friendly. "You're offering what you do not own." Her jaw tightened at the implication. "Then take it with me." "You've already bested the court. The nobles listen to you. The Empress fears you, with the Eastern Army." Kael's voice cut her off, low and unyielding. "You speak of armies." "I speak of fate." Seraphina froze, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read him. The air seemed to crackle with tension, as if the very room were holding its breath. Kael stood, the sound of his cloak rustling a whisper in the night. He stepped closer to the map, his gaze flicking over the empire laid out before him. He rested his fingers on the edge of the map, tapping gently against the capital city. The soft echo of the dagger's edge against the parchment was almost hypnotic. "I do not crave the throne," Kael said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. "I could crush it." "I do not crave power. I define it." Seraphina frowned, confusion flickering across her features. "Then what do you want?" Kael's gaze bore into hers, unyielding, as through the very answer could reshape her destiny. "Control." "I want the world to bend before me, and not because I wear a crown, but because they fear the idea of disobedience." He leaned over the table, his finger pressing lightly against the capital city on the map. "Kings die, thrones burn, but the one who commands the flames, he endures." A heavy silence fell between them, thick with the weight of his words. Seraphina could feel the pull of his conviction, the gravity of his vision drawing her in. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "Then make me your queen." Not in name, but in purpose. Kael studied her for a long moment. He saw the flicker of ambition in her eyes, the fire that had yet to burn out. It was not a willingness to bow to him, but a shared hunger for control, for dominance. And in that moment, he smiled. Beneath the imperial palace, in the forgotten dungeons where the echoes of the past lingered like ghosts, Lucien van Christ knelt alone. The once proud hero of the Empire now bore the scars of defeat. His body was wrecked, a broken vessel of what he once was. Shackles tore at his wrists, and the cold stone beneath him seemed to leach away what little remained of his dignity. His silver hair, once a banner of hope, now clung to his face like a funeral veil. The vibrant light in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something darker, a hollow void that had once been filled with purpose. The cell door groaned open, its rusty hinges squealing in protest. Footsteps echoed in the silence. Then, the Emperor entered. Kael, dressed in black and crimson robes lined with arcane gold, stepped into the flickering torchlight. His gaze settled on Lucien, cold and calculating. "Lucien," he said, his voice smooth and almost affectionate, "my fallen blade." Lucien did not rise. He could not. His body was spent, his strength shattered. "Come to gloat?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "No," Kael replied, his tone devoid of the mockery one might expect. "I came to offer resurrection." The Emperor knelt before Lucien, mirroring his broken posture, as if to show that even in this, they were the same. "You were my sword, my hope, the myth I forged. And now, you wrote a broken bar because of him." Lucien's eyes narrowed. The name that had once been his greatest enemy now a bitter reminder of the world that had fallen apart around him. "Kael, a broken bar." Kael reached into his robe and produced a vial, no larger than a thumb. Its contents pulsed a crimson liquid, alive with an unnatural energy. It whispered of damnation, of power, of the abyss. "Demon's blood," Kael whispered, his voice reverent and laced with promise. "A drop of the abyss. It will make you more than mortal, more than memory." Lucien flinched, his instincts recoiling at the very sight of the vial. "It will make me a monster. It will make you a weapon again," Kael countered, his eyes cold and unwavering. "And weapons don't mourn. They strike." A silence fell between them, thick with the weight of what was being offered. Lucien stared at the vial, its promise hanging in the air like a temptation too great to ignore. A voice, distant and faint, echoed in his mind, a voice he could never forget. Kael's smirk. Kael's hand, crushing everything he once believed sacred. Ilicia's scream. Lucien reached forward, his fingers shaking. The cold of the metal cell-floor seeped into his skin, but he did not care. He took the vial. The imperial palace stood as a testament to centuries of dominance, its towering marble colonnades etched with victories long past. Golden arches stretched upwards, each one a silent monument to the throne's reign, but within these walls, true power did not lie in the royal insignia or in the formality of statecraft. Power tonight would walk unnoticed, without herald or invitation, yet its arrival was inevitable. The Duke of Shadowmarch moved through the palace like a shadow woven into the dark fabric of night. His steps were silent, though each footfall left a tangible sense of weight, as through the very air bowed in his presence. He didn't need an audience. He didn't need permission. In this world, he didn't seek approval. He summoned consequences, and they followed in his wake like loyal hounds. His destination was clear: the Empress's private chambers, a space untouched by the bluster of the court, insulated by walls that whispered of power far older than any emperor. The corridor leading to her quarters was lined with ancient tapestries, their faded threads telling stories of forgotten kings and queens. Imperial guards flanked the door, their rigid postures betraying their unease. Two imposing figures, clad in crimson, weapons at the ready. Yet, as Kael's presence stretched around them, their resolve faltered. Kael didn't pause, nor did he slow his pace. The guards exchanged a fleeting glance, their hands instinctively drifting toward the hilts of their swords. But they knew deep down, that this was not a man to be stopped by steel or ceremony. A mere shift in the air seemed to command them to part. Without a word spoken, the doors opened. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and parchment, a fragrance that spoke of intellect, not indulgence. The chamber was fit for an empress, regal in its elegance but subtle in its grandiosity. Rich crimson drapes framed the hearth, the fire's soft glow flickering against polished wood. Bookshelves lined the walls, stacked high with volumes that could unravel empires with a single read. The light of candles danced, flickering against the shadows, as if they, too, were uncertain of Kael's arrival. Seated behind a desk of intricate ebony, Empress Selene Valerius appeared as the embodiment of composure. Her eyes, sharp as obsidian, lifted from the scroll she had been signing. The quill's tip paused in midair, poised as though it, too, were waiting for her to decide whether or not to acknowledge this uninvited guest. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence between them stretched taut, pregnant with unspoken words. Then, her lips parted, cool and steady. "You've never cared for protocol, have you?" she remarked, her voice the kind of velvet that could slice skin if the listener wasn't careful. Kael's lips curled into a faint smiley one that barely reached his eyes. His gaze, intense and unwavering, fixed upon her. "Protocol is for those who ask," he replied, voice low and smooth, like the promise of a storm. Selene's emerald eyes studied him closely, the slight tension in her posture the only sign that she understood the weight of his presence. She was no stranger to power, but she could not help but feel the edges of her composure fray beneath his steady gaze. Kael moved like a liquid shadow, a creature of control and precision, and his presence seemed to strip away the illusions of the room. For the first time, she felt the weight of something unfamiliar pressing against her, an invisible but undeniable force. "To what do I owe the honor, Lord Arden?" she asked, each syllable carefully chosen, laced with the sharpness of a blade beneath silk. Kael stepped closer, his gloved fingers brushing lightly across the surface of her desk. The motion was deliberate, slow, an idle threat, a reminder of what could be, and what would be, should the need arise. He leaned in, not enough to touch her, but enough to fill the space between them with his overwhelming presence. "The princess has made her move," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made the air seem thicker, as if the very walls had drawn closer to hear him. Selene's eyes narrowed, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Seraphina always was impulsive," she remarked, her voice betraying none of the surprise Kael had expected. "She's offered me the empire," Kael continued, his tone cold, detached. "Or rather, a role in burning it to the ground." Selene's smile didn't fade, but her posture shifted, a subtle change. "And will you play her game?" she asked, the question posed with the kind of casual indifference that could shatter empires if wielded correctly. Kael's eyes never left hers, a flicker of amusement dancing in the depths of his gaze. "No," he said simply. He paused, allowing the silence to stretch and settle between them. It was a silence heavy with the weight of inevitability, as through the world itself held its breath, waiting for what came next. "I prefer my own," he finished, the words spoken with the ease of someone who had never needed to ask for anything, who had always simply taken it. Selene's gaze remained fixed on him, unreadable, her lips pursed in contemplation. She rose from her chair slowly, the movement fluid, almost imperceptible, like a snake coiling. The room seemed to shrink as Kael circled around her desk, closing the distance between them with the relentless precision of a predator. He moved behind her, his presence pressing against the air, suffocating, inevitable. Selene didn't turn to face him, but he could see the slightest tremor in her shoulders, a subtle indication that she felt the weight of his proximity. "I'm not here to serve a crown," Kael said, his voice now a low murmur, laced with a promise of power. "I'm here to decide who wears it." She inhaled slowly, the soft sound a faint tremor of air that betrayed the calm facade she so carefully crafted. Her lips pressed together as she exhaled. "And you think I can be decided?" she asked, her voice no longer as controlled, no longer as certain. There was something in her tone now, a flicker of something darker, something raw. Kael didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved closer still, his breath brushing against her neck, close enough to feel the heat of her skin. His fingers, clad in leather, hovered just behind her chair, poised like a cobra ready to strike. She didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. Instead, she remained perfectly still, her body a mask of discipline, even as her mind raced. "I'm not here to negotiate," he whispered, his voice a quiet promise of control. I don't need your loyalty. I will take your place beside me because this empire no longer answers to your husband. Not truly. The words were like the first cut of a knife, a precise wound that would fester and grow, impossible to heal. And if I resist? Celine's voice was a quiet challenge, the question hanging in the air like an invitation to war. Kael's breath brushed her neck, his lips almost grazing her skin as he spoke. Then I'll make you want to surrender. The room was charged with an intensity that could shatter stone, the space between them thick with the unspoken promise of what was to come. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced like specters on the walls, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. Celine turned slowly, her gaze locking with his, mere inches between them. The Empress, the Duke. Two sovereign forces, their blades sheathed beneath layers of manipulation, their storms masked by poise. Her eyes, sharp as daggers, bore into his, searching for the cracks in his facade, but there was nothing but cold, burning certainty. Her voice, when it came, was softer, an almost imperceptible shift in tone. Is that a threat, Claudine? She asked, the words no longer as confident, no longer as sharp. No, Kael replied, his voice like icy, cool, unyielding. It's a promise. The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with unspoken words. Celine's lips parted slightly, whether in surprise or something deeper, something she couldn't quite grasp. The fleeting moment lingered, but only for a heartbeat. Kael knew, in that instant, that she was no longer unreachable, no longer beyond his grasp. He had cracked her, and that, in itself, was the first step toward domination. The Empress's chambers bore the lingering remnants of upheaval, sheets tangled like battlefield banners, wine glasses overturned on polished tables, and a warmth in the air that refused to fade. Dawn filtered through the tall, arched windows in pale gold strands, illuminating the figure standing on the balcony. Claudine. He was bare from the waist up, the fresh light casting sculpted shadows across his torso. Muscles coiled beneath skin marked by subtle scars, reminders of victories no history dared to record. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, and not searching, but calculating, like a general reading the future in the folds of the sky. Behind him, Empress Celine stirred beneath the sheets. You never sleep, she murmured, voice thick with the velvet residue of the night. I don't need dreams, Kael replied, still watching the city below. Dreams are for men who hope. I move. She slid from the bed, silk whispering against her skin as she approached. The Empress had always been beautiful, elegant, distant, untouchable. But now there was something different about her. Something molten, gleamed. I gave you power last night, she said, slipping her arms around his waist, her cheek against his back. But only because you proved you could take it. Kael didn't turn. Last night wasn't about power. No? Her lips curved. Then what was it? Alignment. He finally faced her. The empire is shifting. It needs a new center. One that doesn't crack under the weight of legacy. Celine stepped back, tightening her robe. Her face was unreadable, but Kael could see the gears turning behind her violet eyes. Castiel still rules, she said. For now. Celine moved toward her dressing table, pouring water into a silver basin. And Serafina? She believes she's playing me, Kael said. Let her. The more she believes she's in control, the more precise the collapse will be. She looked up at him through the mirror. And when it all crumbles? Kael crossed the chamber to her, setting a hand lightly on her shoulder. Then you and I build something new. Not from ashes, but from the bones of what came before. A knock at the door interrupted them. Celine stepped away and called, Enter. A young handmaiden stepped in, bowed deeply. Your Majesty, the Emperor has summoned you both to the throne room. At once. Celine glanced at Kael, her tone a calm mask. Did he say why? No, Your Majesty. Only that it concerns the future of the realm. Kael's lips twitched. Then let's hear what the old lion has left in his roar. The throne room stood like a mausoleum of grandeur, towering pillars, obsidian floors polished like still water, and the massive black throne upon its dais. Golden tapestries bearing the imperial crest hung motionless, the air tense as a held breath. Emperor Castiel Valerius sat upon his throne, regal as ever, but Kael could see the fracture lines. The eyes were too bright, the smile too cold. Power clung to him like rusted armor, formidable, but crumbling. To his right, kneeling like a knight returned from hell, was Lucien. Kael's breath stilled for a heartbeat. The transformation was grotesque. Lucien's once brilliant armor had been twisted into something jagged and dark, a mockery of heroism. His silver hair hung in damp strands, and his aura, once radiant with idealism, had been blackened, warped by unnatural magic. Demon's blood, Kael murmured beneath his breath. Castiel's smile widened. "Welcome," the Emperor said. "I trust your night was restful." Selene moved with poise, every inch the Empress. "Your summons was unexpected." "Was it?" Castiel descended a single step from his throne. The court brims with treachery, whispers in every corridor, dagger eyes behind every goblet of wine. "I've decided to clear the rot." Kael said nothing, watching Lucien closely. His former rival's hands were clenched around the hilt of a black blade, a weapon alive with something malevolent. Kael didn't need to be close to feel it. It radiated hunger. "Lucien returns to us, not just as hero," Castiel continued, "but as retribution, reforged in fire and oath." Lucien's eyes met Kael's. There was no sanity left in them, only wrath. Selene's voice was ice. "And what, may I ask, is he here to punish?" Castiel turned to the side. With a gesture, the doors opened. Two guards dragged a bloodied man through the chamber. His once noble robes were soaked in crimson, one eye swollen shut. "Duke Reinhardt." Kael raised a brow. He'd expected Castiel to move sooner, but not so openly. "Your Grace," Castiel said mockingly. "You stand accused of sedition, conspiracy, and collusion with foreign powers." Reinhardt's voice was hoarse, but defiant. "Your empire is a tomb, Castiel. I only sought to breathe life back into it." "Then let your death be its exhale," Castiel said. He nodded. Lucien rose. Kael stepped forward. "A public execution in the throne room?" "Justice must be seen to be believed," Castiel replied. "Don't you agree?" Kael's voice was like a silk blade. "Justice isn't spectacle, but desperation often is." Lucien moved with silent grace, blade rising. For the briefest instant, Kael saw it gain a hesitation, a flicker of humanity buried beneath the corruption. But it passed. The blade fell. Blood painted the floor like spilled ink across a scroll of history. Reinhardt slumped forward, eyes wide but unseeing. The silence that followed was deafening. Castiel turned toward Selene. "Let this be the end of whispers. The Empire is one voice." "Mine." Kael inclined his head. "Of course, Your Majesty." But the words were meaningless, because Kael had already seen the truth. This was not strength. This was the last, desperate growl of a fading lion. Later, back in the Empress's private solar, Kael poured himself a glass of wine. Selene stood by the window, her fingers clenching the sill. "He's unraveling," she said. "Yes," Kael agreed. "And now everyone knows it. He wants a war." Kael sipped slowly. "Let him build his army. Let him arm his demon-ruined pet. The more he prepares for a storm, the more he ignores the crack beneath his feet." Selene turned. "Lucien won't stop." "Not now." "No," Kael said. "But he can be broken." She approached him, gaze unreadable. "You're sure?" He set the goblet down. "I don't need to be sure. I just need to make him doubt." Her hand touched his chest, trailing slowly downward. "Then make me believe again." Kael caught her wrist before she could go further. "Not tonight," he said softly. "Tonight we remember the rules of this game. Every touch is a move, every breath a gambit." Her eyes narrowed. "And what move is this?" He leaned in, brushing his lips just barely against hers. "The one where I let the world believe I've stepped back a broken bar when I'm already inside the throne."